Alright, we are good to go. Who wants to start? Okay. Hi, I'm Guy. I like this game. Alright, so for me, I was introduced to the Fire Emblem series with Awakening. And I decided to go back to Blazing Sword after that one because everybody said, oh, it has a really in-depth tutorial, it's pretty easy by the classic game standards, you'll probably like it. And I did like it, but I also, didn't reset when people died and I got to, the Yuhai chapter with only the lords left. So I dropped the game for a while, went to Sacred Stones, and then came back to this one. I still liked it, I was just bad at it.
Youth for me, but for me, Blazing Sword remains really my favorite Fire Emblem of all time, the first and still the best, even though it wasn't the first. And it's really one of my favorite games of all time. So that's a high bar to set for the discussion coming up. But here you go.
Hold on just a minute, John. I hate that you just did that. Because people are saying apparently they can only hear me, and I don't know why that is.
I just saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that too.
I have no idea
Oh,
why
that's-
that
that's
is.
so
I've never had
disappointing.
I've never had that problem before.
That is really
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah, because that means we might end up having to repeat ourselves. That would suck.
That's embarrassing.
Oh, someone said they could hear me.
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear the whack job named Grant? Testing.
Oh, hey, they're hearing everybody now. Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Perfect.
Thumbs up if you hear Alessandra.
So do we need to?
Cool.
Do we need to repeat ourselves? Did they hear everything before?
I don't know. I'm
I don't know.
looking into a fix for this though.
Okay.
Yeah, we want a
Okay.
reintroduction. Okay.
All
Back
right.
to square one, guys.
Minor setback.
Sorry
Take
about.
2. We got a little practice in. That's all good.
Take 2.
Okay. Okay. So for the sake of speeding things up, we'll introduce ourselves, say how we were introduced to the game, and then hopefully we can move forward. All right. So I'm Grant. I was first introduced to Fire Emblem with Path of Radiance. Loved it. Dad got me Blazing Sword and a Game Boy for my birthday. I played it everywhere I went. Loved it. And yeah, so that's why I'm here.
I went next. Okay. So, for me.
Oh,
like-
yeah, that's right. Everybody could hear Guy, right?
Oh well, then I don't have to say it. I
Yeah.
don't have to repeat myself. You go ahead.
Oh, cool. So short form. My name's John. I participated in the Thracia podcast. It was a lot of fun. Glad to be back. This is my absolute favorite Fire Emblem. It's the first I ever played. I played it in freshman year of college, like right after it was released, I think, and haven't looked back since. So good. So good. Still remains one of my favorite games of all time.
All right. Good taste.
Alessia?
Okay, so I'm Alessia. I was in the Sacred Stones podcast before. I was introduced to Fire Emblem with Gaiden and Holy War, which were the first ones I actually really played. But then that year, my cousin gifted me copies of Sacred Stones and FE7 for the GBA. So the first ones I really got in tune with the actual mechanics with was Blazing Sword after I failed horrendously at the first 2 chapters of Sacred Stones. So that's how I got in touch with Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem 7.
Hi, I'm Marisa. This is my first podcast that I'm doing. I was introduced to Fire Emblem 7. It was also my first Fire Emblem game, like John. I got introduced to it when I was in high school. A friend of mine had started playing it, and at that point, it hadn't just come out. I think Path of Radiance was the latest game that had come out at that point. But my one friend started playing it, and he got really into it and just talked about it constantly, every single day. So I was just curious about it, so I went out, and I bought it. And it was over the weekend, and it was, I remember it was Sunday night, and it was like 8 o'clock, and I was like, I should probably start up that game. I'll play it for like an hour or two. So I started it, and 4 hours later, I was still playing it. I just couldn't stop, and I've been hooked ever since.
Marisa, I have to say, I kind of expected more of us to have that experience where this was our first Fire Emblem because it was the first one released in the States.
Yeah, same.
It's interesting that we've come at Blazing Sword at a number of different directions.
I also feel like I'm probably one of the only people in the world who I was not introduced to Fire Emblem through Smash Brothers, but the other way around. Somebody told me that there were Fire Emblem characters in Smash Brothers, and I was like, I need to play.
Neat.
Hey, that's like me.
Cool.
My cousin had like every every Kaga game on his modded Xbox, and he had me after he had me play Genealogy and Gaiden and gave me the GBA games. He was like, "Hey, did you know a couple of these characters are in Smash Bros?" And I was like, "What?"
Yeah, it was actually one of my teachers in high school that told me about it.
Yeah, I was a Marth main in Melee, and then I saw Ike, and I was like, wait, that's not Marth, but it's just Fire Emblem.
Radical headband mark.
I got introduced
I-
through Smash 4 because I had never really been into it, but all my friends in high school were, and they were like, "Oh, hey, guy, you should get Smash 4." I was like, "Okay," And they're like, oh, since you're new, you should play Lucina because she's really easy to learn. And I was like, okay. I was like, oh, I want to know what she's from. And that's how I got Awakening.
Oh, wow.
So, pretty typical story for me.
All right. So, with that, I guess we'll move on to our first item that we were going to discuss for podcast, which is the story. So Blazing Sword is usually one of the Fire Emblem games that's noted for having a good story. So naturally, it'd be prudent to talk about that first. The first question we had on our agenda was, what do you think Fire Emblem 7 gets right with its narrative? Marisa, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I wrote down a couple of things. The first thing I wrote down is that I think the Black Fang is actually a really strong part of the narrative. I think it's just interesting, the idea of an honorable assassins guild, and I really liked how the layers of command were shown to the player all throughout the game. How you see how they're being manipulated from the inside by Sonia and Nurgle. I think the relationships between the characters in the Black Fang are one of the more interesting parts of the game. How the Reed brothers have kind of their relationship, how Nino has relationships with various different members, her relationship with Sonia. It just felt like a lot of thought went into the Black Fang and fleshing them out, and it felt very believable to me.
I find really compelling about the Black Fang the fact that we see this organization that is, clearly the antagonist for the lion's share of the game. It is like full of people doing really bad stuff in service of Nurgle, and yet most of the people we see inside of it, save for the morphs who aren't human, most of the humans we see inside of it, are genuinely sympathetic people trying to do the right thing. I find that incredibly compelling.
Exactly.
It's kind of funny. They're kind of like the Robin Hood and his merry men, but more evil, I guess. They're more sinister and they're a little more hardcore. But it is kind of cool that assassins are portrayed in sort of a more humanizing light. Because usually in fiction, assassins are just these killing machines who just don't really have a thought much for anything other than killing. And to have this sort of angle was well done.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. I actually wanted to discuss the Black Fang for when we talk about antagonists later, but can I just drop what I wanted to say right here, if that's okay?
Go ahead.
All right, so this was honestly one of the harder questions for me to answer when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about in the podcast. But I think that the Black Fang as a group of antagonists are incredibly well done. And there is so much build-up with the tension surrounding what's going on with Nurgle's involvement in the story and the morphs and Ephodel manipulating people in the background. And I find that they're so human. Even the more minor members, like Brendan Reed, they get the kind of character development and interaction with other antagonists that you don't see a lot in other Fire Emblem games with their minor antagonists. Every member of the Black Fang has some sort of important relationship with another member or someone outside of the group, and I think that's just the way the game characterizes them is incredibly important for the narrative of the story as a whole.
Oh man, Alessia, characterization of villains is like my thing in Fire Emblem. I'm so glad you appreciate that as much as I do. But it's that's totally right.
You're welcome.
I to kind of riff a little bit on what you said, the progression, come to think of it, is really well done, right? Because the first impression you have of the Black Fang is, this little cameo in Lynn's story where it's just like evil group of assassins, period. It's that easy. And then you come to figure out that actually they used to be a bunch of Robin Hoods, but they've transformed into this evil group of assassins. So it's a little bit of nuance. And then you start seeing these scenes of behind the action, and it's like, oh, well, actually, it's still this group that does bad things now, but really all the people involved are still who used to be involved, and they all have a lot of misgivings about this, and there's just a lot of grating tension between the people in the organization and the organization itself, and there's just like layer after layer after layer of nuance added onto the Black Fang. to the point where
Yeah.
you start seeing like people like Legault who are like, okay, I'm done with it. It's time to go.
Yeah,
Yeah, I like how
Yeah.
you also even see if you go to different villages and towns in the game on certain maps, like even people in the villages will talk about the Black Fang and how they helped them out, how like they kind of see them as heroes.
Yeah, like I love the way they're in Lynn's the way that they're portrayed in Lynn's mode though, because they're kind of treated like villainous group of enemies of the week, chapter throwaways. But then they're just gone from that part of the story, and then you continue in the story, move into Eliwood's mode, and then you realize they're behind so many different things that were going on in Lynn's mode and then in Eliwood's story, and they're behind just about everything going on, and as you go through the story, you're just slowly piecing together everything in this giant web of storytelling, and I love it.
I think another interesting point about the narrative in Fire Emblem 7 is that it's a very personal, very very small scale. There's a lot of Fire Emblem games, they kind of are in, they're in duos. And it's one of the games in the duos is going to be a large scale epic continental war, and the other one's going to be more about individual people. And I think tying in that and the Black Fang though does feel very more personalized, and it kind of makes sense for a smaller scale story that you got a group of assassins, people who target small group individuals and do a lot of sneaking behind the shadows. Because in Binding Blade, it's big scale war, countries fighting against countries, and here it's like, oh, we're fighting behind the scenes. This is the behind the scenes stuff. We're trying to prevent the big scale stuff from happening. I think it's a cool thing, and I think that ties into the Black Fang as well.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, so what do you think, Guy?
The thing that sticks out to me, John covered it pretty well, about the games is the theme, really. I think the overall theming of how good people get corrupted by power. And I think both this game and its successor do this really well. I'll just sum it up in 4 words and be done with it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. We can look at Nurgle and see he had a good goal, and look what he turned into. He forgot what he was fighting for.
Guy, I think you were cutting in and out a little bit of that. I'm not sure
Am
if
I?
anybody
Do I need
else...
to repeat myself?
I
Yeah,
heard
you
you
cut
just
out a little
fine.
bit for me.
Okay.
I heard it as well, yeah.
Does
Maybe I
anyone
can
else
say it a
have
little better this time. So
Yeah,
the thing,
I kind of caught the gist of it though, but
so the thing that sticks out to me the most about Fire Emblem 7 and kind of its successor to an extent is this theme of good people gaining power and losing sight of what they're fighting for. Like, look at Nurgle, who was fighting for a good cause, and then by the time we see him in the game itself, when Lynn and Hector and Eliwood go to confront him, he's little more than a madman. He doesn't even know why he wants all this power. He just knows he does.
yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think Nurgle and, as you said, you were saying Sacred Stones as well. So Lion is, I think they're both really good examples of that as villains in Fire Emblem.
Another good saying that I think would fit this is the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For sure.
He wanted to do something he thought was right, but it corrupted him to the point, and he just went so far down that he just lost sight of everything.
Yep, that's actually for the listeners at home, one of the questions Grant had asked later in the podcast asked us to explain kind of a plot point that really has a lot of significance to us. Nurgle is going to be mine, so we can discuss this at greater length there. But yes, I think I find that really, really compelling as well in Fire Emblem structure. It's something that's always stood out to me playing a bunch of different Fire Emblems is that thematically they always have a message that is at both soaringly positive and deeply, deeply tragic, and Nurgle is definitely the tragic side of this particular Fire Emblem, and that's part of why, he tries to do his best to pursue one goal that really means more than anything to him, and the very pursuit of that goal makes him forget it and drives him into a place of deep darkness.
Since we're already on the subject, we might as well expand into it. Piggybacking off what you said, John, that is very much a thing. I think a lot, and it's so easy to miss too. I think that's what helps to make Blazing Sword so replayable. It's like, oh, this little detail, it changes so much. That idea that Nurgle, he forgot everything when he came through the gate, and he kind of turned into more of a mustache twirling villain who lost sight of everything. It really does give him a lot of tragedy and depth that you don't normally see with a dark sorcerer's Garneth archetype like this.
Yeah, he's kind of an accidental Garneth, right? Like he wouldn't have been Garneth except for the fact that the magic just warped who he was by changing through the portal.
Yeah, and I love how throughout the courses of Fire Emblem 7's Eliwood and Hector's modes, how you can unlock various guidance chapters, and by playing the game multiple times, you can unlock various pieces of Nurgle's story by fulfilling certain requirements. And I think it's really well done, because the first couple times playing it, you see Nurgle and you see what he's doing, and you get a glimpse of why he is what he is. But as I said, if you unlock those extra guidance chapters with Kashuna, etc., then you learn so much more, and it adds so much more depth to his character, and it also adds a great layer of replayability to the game.
And if you come to think of it, that's actually kind of exactly the same sort of progression you see when you look at the Black Fang, right? You see the immediate, the very nature of the structure of Fire Emblem 7, like as a game, makes you see Nurgle in one way first, and then procedurally add nuance to his character until in Hector's mode you're like, oh wow, he's a way different person than I thought he was when I was playing through Eliwood's story. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, if I can tie this into my point, that I think Fire Emblem gets really well with its narrative. I had two things listed. The more important one for me is thematic. I think that ties right into it. I see this game as a story about finding purpose, and there are kind of two roads that diverge into how you find purpose as a human. There's the road where purpose is found by perfecting who you are as a person, like turning inward and looking at the self, and there is purpose found in fellowship with other people and being a more perfect part of a group. I think what this game wants to say is that turning too far inward, paradoxically, like while you're trying to make a more perfect self, it tends to destroy the very things that make you human, while being part of a group, even though that might deny some part of your individuality, that really makes us more truly and completely human. I think that's reflected in a number of ways. I'm sure I'm going to talk about that a lot over the next few hours. But I think that's reflected throughout the structure of the Black Fang, throughout how we see Nurgle, throughout how the three leads interact through the game. It's just a game that stresses that we make the choice to choose to work together consciously and constantly all the time. That's what I think it's about.
What do you think, Marisa?
I was going to say, just following that, I think that you can really see that, especially where towards the end when they bring in Nino and Jafar and they end up joining you, is exactly what you were just saying, how it's about being part of a group and being stronger because of that, because obviously there were some tensions between them and Jafar, but they were willing to go past that for the sake of accomplishing something greater.
Something that's kind of, something that's now sticking out to me is that in some ways Fire Emblem 7 talks about what it means to be human. for those of you who are listening in and commenting on the podcast, I'm currently going through an FMA binge right now, and so that's another theme and question that kind of gets brought up. And funny enough, the morphs do kind of remind me of the homunculi in that story, and we see this idea of what it means to be human in different ways. We got Nurgle, who originally had very good motives, very good reasons for sending his kids through the gate, trying to get him back, and then he loses sight of his humanity. He loses sight of that ultra power, and then what happens? He becomes the Garneth. And then Nino kind of represents that sort of theme as well. It's like, oh, I'm going to be required to kill this kid? No, I don't want to do that. There's also Jafar, who's kind of trying to regain his humanity, despite being the stereotypical, silent but deadly type of assassin. He's like, yeah, I'm not going to let you kill this kid. And that's a nice touch of humanity and humanization as well.
Yeah, I actually wrote a little bit about that for the part about talking about villains and what impact they had on the story. Mm-hmm. About how I think the contrast between Limstella and Sonia is really interesting in regards to their humanity or lack thereof. How Sonia, she's just so convinced that she's human, she's so in denial of being a morph, and that's something that she has to face then at the end. Wherein Limstella, on the other hand, is so aware of the fact that she's a morph and that she's not human, that even, like, her death quote is my favorite in the entire series, when she says, actually I have it right here, she says, I am not human, this mind and body are constructs, yes, as is this sorrow. So she's just so aware of her status as a morph that she actually denies her own actual emotions, or any claim to humanity that she might have.
Yeah, that is a good point. I forgot about that. Yeah, because, in the end, I guess they're both kind of monstrous in a way. When Stella's sort of the cold, detached, emotionless kind of monster, then Sonia, who's very monstrous on a human level, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting contrast between the two, especially since you mentioned Limstella's death quote, where Sonia's in so much denial with the fact that she's a morph and that she's not human. She's so stuck in denial, even in her dying moments, where she even says in her death quote, "This is impossible. I am perfect. Lord Nurgle said so."
Yeah.
So she's so convinced that she's human and that she's perfect and beautiful, that even as I said, even in her dying breath, she won't admit it.
There's also Kishuna as well. He's a non-combat morph, but he's actually, supposed to be, but he's able to feel emotions. He kind of feels maybe like an in-between Sonia and Limstella, I guess, in that respect. Because, he could feel emotion, but he doesn't. But he's not super expressive about it.
Here's a question for you: Can
Yes.
can morphs really feel emotion? I'm thinking about all the data points we have, right? So, everybody says, consensus in the game is that morphs can't feel emotion. That's just what they are. They're soulless things, husks of superhuman on the outside and dead on the inside. And yeah, of what we see is Kishuna's, a failed morph who can feel emotion, and his sorrow consumes him and all that. Sonia feels utter surprise at the end of her life when she's overtaken. She feels just shock at finding out that she's not actually human. She laughs at people frequently. She feels herself superior to others as the game goes on. Ephidel feels abandoned and shocked when he's left in front of the Dragon's Gate to die by, his maker. And Limstella, as much as she stays straight-faced and delivers that last line, her very last word is, "I feel sorrow. This can't be real." Can morphs really feel emotion?
I think that's an interesting question, because I look at morphs in the very same way as the homunculus in Full Metal Alchemist. And Sonia and Lust are very, very similar characters. And the way I look at it is that I don't think they actually feel, but I think that, like the homunculus in Fullmetal Alchemists, they remember those feelings of the spirit energy or quintessence pulled from the people that were used to create them. That's my personal theory.
Oh, I like that theory. The fact that
That's really
human
interesting,
exists, like the power of human life, just always contains humanity with it. That's neat.
Yeah.
I've always
That's how
thought
they
that
explained it in FMA, because they remembered the feelings of the people before them. But yeah, I think that's probably a similar thing in FE7 with the morphs.
I think they do have feelings. Limstella, she insists that I think it's really that she questions the validity of what she feels, because she says that she feels sorrow, but it's like she doesn't consider it to be valid because it's a construct. It was made, so it wasn't like a naturally occurring thing, you know. But I don't think that makes it not real. So yeah, I would say they do feel.
Or perhaps they were just conditioned to think that they can't feel by Nurgle. Perhaps that could be another answer in order to contain control over them.
I think another similarity they have to the homunculi is that the morphs are created with a very specific purpose by their creator in mind, and that purpose is, to serve and to do whatever their creator tells them to do, and so they're created to be mindless machines in a sense. But at least in my opinion, like the homunculi, they're not. I would say yes, they are capable of feeling. Sonia and Ephidel are pretty straight up arrogant. They're both very condescending, and I think Sonia in particular too is always like, well, I'm better than you humans, and that kind of reminds me of the homunculi, especially in Brotherhood, where they're always kind of talking down to humans and assuming that they are the superior life form.
Yeah, I'd say you could probably say she's a little bit of a mix of lust and envy in that regard.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I'd say that.
If our consensus is that morphs can feel emotion, that adds yet another level to the sympathy I feel for Kishuna, who thought that the one reason he was rejected was because he could feel things that other morphs weren't supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, now I feel like after this podcast, I want to go make like a couple of blog posts about this topic. It's so fascinating.
Do it.
And that's what Fire Emblem 7 makes you do, right? It tells its story so well that it makes you think about all this stuff, and it all reflects back on the nature of humanity. It's so good, guys. It's so good.
Absolutely.
So anyway, since the question of like what's the story beat that you can really well came up since it was John since we moved on to that with John. Say is okay with that if I bring up mine now?
Go ahead.
Alright, so this one's a pretty hot topic in specifically Nino's Magical Circle Jerk that I have seen people get so heated over. But I'm gonna say it anyways. My favorite story moment in the entire story of Fire Emblem 7 is the scene in Burn where Eliwood yells at the Queen of Burn, Helene.
Oh, that's so good.
It's such a good scene. I'm with you. I know exactly where you're going with this. Keep going.
You could call it the sick burn.
And God bless Ryan Drury for bringing up the topic of depression and mental health in Nino's Magical Circle Jerk yesterday, because this ties in exactly with the comments I was making on that thread. Anyone who is part of that thread knows what I'm talking about. I suffered a lot of abuse from my parents, a lot of abuse and neglect, and nobody was ever there to put a stop to it. Not one person in my entire life ever stepped up and said, hey, this is wrong, you need to stop. I was pushed around, I was degraded, I was used. But the scene where Eliwood loses his shit at Helene, where Eliwood and Lynn try to, and when Lynn tries to gang up on her, is so powerful to me, because Eliwood in that moment did something that no one ever did for me when I was suffering similarly to Zephiel was as a child. He stepped in, He said, "This is wrong. This needs to stop. He is your child. What the F are you doing?" And that, like, I know a lot of people say, that's such a stupid move. That's a horrible political move for Eliwood to make. That could just ruin any chance he has of getting any political help from Byrne. And I recognize that. But his actions in that moment just spoke to me ever since I first played Fire Emblem 7, because when I first played this game, all the crap that was happening to me, all the abuse that I was talking about in Nino's yesterday, was still going on. Eliwood, in yelling at Helene, was kind of like a beacon for me. A beacon for my 12-year-old self who was suffering through all this neglect and emotional abuse. Anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that Eliwood is really a tragically underrated lord in so many ways, because he has such great moments like that as a character. Like, I also love, I love how after he accidentally kills Ninian, like, he could have just kind of given up or just been consumed by his own hatred or self-loathing, but he instead kept fighting because he knew it was that there were things that were bigger than him going on. So, yeah, I just feel like he's a great character.
Totally agreed. And I think...
And he
go
totally is. Sorry. Like, anytime I see people in any forum online saying that Eliwood's such a bad character because he makes these mistakes in the Byrne section of the game, I feel like my brain's imploding a little bit, because he's a flawed character, but he's great because of it. Anyways, you can talk now.
No, that's totally true. And I think...
Absolutely.
I kind of have two reactions to that. The first is that Eliwood is awesome. I think Eliwood's reaction in moments like that, and after his dad's death, and after Ninian's death, I think all of those are reactions he might not have had if he weren't in the company of Hector and Lynn. I think they both... This is a subject for different discussion, but I think they both kind of bring out parts of him that he isn't necessarily naturally disposed to. He is diplomatic and polite to a fault. I don't think Eliwood before Lynn and Hector could have stood up to Helene of Byrne and said, "What are you doing to your son? Do you even care about him at all?" That would not have been in Eliwood's vocabulary in like a political situation before traveling for 10-20 chapters with his friends.
That's a good point.
And the other thing that comes to mind is that, as ridiculous a blunder as that may be as a political move, like, immediately after the scene, Eliwood's like, "Well, I probably shouldn't have said that." And Pent's like, "You didn't say a word that wasn't true." And lo and behold, wait 5 minutes, and Helene catches up with them after the palace and says, she doesn't say how she feels about how the confrontation went, but you kind of get the impression that having someone lay, like, really clearly on the table what she's doing to her son kind of made her change her mind and say, "Look, here's a map, here's this seal, take these, I need to think about this for a while." And then we know what happens to Zephiel in the end, so it's yet more tragedy on top of that story.
You know,
Yeah.
I agree that it may not have been the diplomatically best move, but I still think it needed to be said, because I remember thinking the same thing that Eliwood was back when I was first playing. I'm like, wait, Helen's being kind of she's being an awful mom to try and use Zephiel as a political pawn, and then Eliwood kind of said what I was thinking. I'm like, thank you! But, you know, and I think that was very much an Ike moment right there, where he's just telling her off regardless of the consequences. But I think it was also the best move, because it was honest, and considering that he just helped, Zephiel not die, it kind of gives him a little more clout to say that. And I think it also speaks to his humanity as well. Going back to that theme, is that, even though these are, human people, even though Helene and Zephiel are both human, she's using him like a pawn. And that's probably a big part of the reason why Zephiel ended up being so messed up. It's that his dad's always mad at him for, being a good prince, ironically, and his mom's just trying to use him because, the because he had Guinevere, and she's trying to make sure Zephiel gets on the throne. It's a very Game of Thrones-ish type of
Yeah, really.
move.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, in my case, my mom reminds me a lot of Helene, because my mom, she would sweep everything bad under the rug and try to use me to try and build this great public image to the outside. So she really did kind of. I've always looked at Helene as kind of hand in hand with my own mother, and in a way, I found her to be really hateable, but I also relate, but it also causes me to relate to young Zephiel as well, and the stuff that he was going through as a child.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I wrote down for the question, which was what impact does Fire Emblem 7 have on the story and world building of Fire Emblem 6, was Zephiel's inclusion. I think his inclusion in Fire Emblem 7 was like the best thing that ever happened to him as a character, because it really does make him so much more sympathetic, because you see what he was going through as a kid, all of the stuff that he went through, and I just think it fleshes him out so much more.
And it's so incredible to see that, like, there's not even... We know what Zephiel will become from Fire Emblem 6, but there's not a trace of that until the epilogue when he's grown, that we see in him as a child. We see him going through all of this, like, he is in the periphery of this awfulness that his parents and politics are throwing on his family, but he just stays so optimistic and upbeat. And, like, even after, like, the very last scene we see of him as a child, he's just saying, I think this is all going to turn out okay. He prays for his family to come together despite every sign that it won't, which is what makes it even more tragic. I think I keep coming back to Fire Emblem 7 because it's a great story, sure. Part of it being a great story is that there are some scenes that are really profoundly uncomfortable to watch, and the scenes with Desmond and Helene are definitely on that list for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, like, with Zephiel and how he becomes in Fire Emblem 7, that kind of relates to something else I had written down, is that I feel like without the existence of Fire Emblem 7, Fire Emblem 6's story would just kind of suck and fall flat. Like, I think Fire Emblem 6 is a pretty solid game. I think it has a lot of technical flaws, but for us, the story itself feels very empty. And I feel that Fire Emblem 7's world building and storytelling and characterization of the characters that were in Fire Emblem 6 that are important to Fire Emblem 7 was done just well enough that it allows Fire Emblem 6's story to hold up.
Fire Emblem 7 kind of makes the continent of Ellaby feel more like a lived-in place. Because with Fire Emblem 6, one of the downsides of a large-scale continental war is that you don't get the personal touch as much, because it feels like the plot's a lot more crammed in. It feels like there's a lot more, okay, we have to go to this continent, we have to go to this country. Oh, there's a coup, so we have to go to this country. It's a lot more larger scale, whereas, something like 7, you get a very closer, in-depth look into the characterization, into actual people's lives. And I do think that's another impact, too, is that, okay, we went up to all these places, but what are the people like? What's the place like? And so we get that with 7. So it helped. So it's like FE6 kind of gave us the skeletal structure, and then Fire Emblem 7 gives us the meat on the bones, as it were. For a while, what do you think about all this, Guy?
Oh boy.
You know what? Go on.
I just kind of said this in the chat. When it comes to relating to FE6, I'm not a fan of FE6, but I am a fan of FE7, and I think the difference. Maybe this is just a personal taste thing for me. It might not have anything to do with execution. I honestly haven't given FE6 enough attention to decide that. For me, I enjoy the kind of games, especially the way Fire Emblem does them, that are more introspective, that focus more on the characters as people and how they respond to the world around them and the situations that they find themselves in. I love Gaiden for this reason. I love Thracia 776 for this reason. I like Path of Radiance for this reason. Blazing Blade is no different. And that scene that y'all dug into really well with Elwood fussing at Helen is one of the big examples of why this game is so great on that end for me. I don't really have much to add about that. It's a good scene, and it kind of baffles me. I'm not going to name any names because this is supposed to be a professional podcast, but I see people in the community who like some of the more emotional tended characters, but not Elwood. And it kind of baffles me because Elwood does the same, like, he has that same moment. That moment of him fussing at Helen is his quote-unquote stupid moment. Yeah, you can see it as a stupid move. It was a horrible political move, but he didn't care about the politics. He saw a child suffering, and he did what he thought he had to do to stop it. So, Elwood is not one of my favorites, but I do like him, and I think saying that is less a testament of Elwood being mediocre, because he's not, and more so just how great some of the other lords in the series are. Did that go through?
Yes, okay. I did. Now I kind of want to play Fire Emblem 7 and just take another look at Elwood as a character.
Oh man, I know what I'm doing after this. I am booting up my Wii and playing FE7.
Nice.
I think that's a decision we can all get behind.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I love Elwood. Elwood and Lynn are fantastic, and Hector is also part of the cast. But I think I think the three of them can do the remarkable things they do. This is one of my main points about this game, so I'm glad we can tie right into it. I think the three of them can do the incredible things they end up doing in this game because they work together. I think the three of them bring very kind of set and straightforward ways of seeing the world and handling situations. And it's only because they're exposed to each other that they kind of are able to move ahead and achieve, greater things. So in my estimation, what happens with Elwood is he confronts most situations through diplomacy, politeness, is loath to engage in violence and conflict. Hector is precisely the opposite. Hector jumps straight to violence and shoots from the hip. He doesn't really, take time to intuit or talk, and doesn't really care about that. And then you have Lynn, who is very good at listening to people, but also very good at being impulsive. Her Sasaiyan honesty, which is I was reading the script for this game. It's apparently a much bigger plot point than I had recalled, but the fact that Sasaiyans don't lie, that is both Lynn's major flaw and her major strength. We can talk more about Lynn later, because I'll talk more about Lynn later. I think the important point is that they all three feed off of each other to really take on each other's kind of characteristics and ways to approach new situations that they would not otherwise have done before they met each other. And I think that is what makes them such a good team and so able to, avert this horrible fate of the world, is because they're able to draw on each other's personalities in times of crisis where their own personalities might not be the best approach.
In that respect, their differences are very complementary. And I think there are situations where you either need to be more like Hector and take direct action, and then there are also times like Elwood where it's like, well, politeness, diplomacy, and civility are probably the smarter options to go.
And I used to not really like Lynn as a character. I feel very neutral towards her as a character, but I think that the trio of lords in FE7, though they could exist independently, I don't think that for the narrative of the story, that they should exist independently. I think that they complete each other as characters. And the way they bounce off each other is just incredible throughout the stories that the game presents to us.
The amount they grow, like Ellawood in chapter whatever is his first one, 11, would never have been able to stand up to Helene and say, "What the heck are you doing to your son?" Hector in chapter 12, when he joins, like, is a totally different person, just striking down the guard at the Santa Ruz border, than he is at the end of the game, when he's able to work as a part of a team and listen to people and think before he does things. Like, you can see them growing as people throughout the arc of the narrative, which is, again, one more token of the excellent writing behind this game.
Yeah, and they don't just grow alone either. They grow together. Their characters, like almost every major story beat that allows the three main lords to grow and to, like the life experiences they gather. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words here. They do it together, and not only does it better their relationships to each other, but as I said, they grow as characters one another. They experience a wide variety of events together, and it's very interesting. Like because I think Fire Emblem 8, where it has more than one lord with Erica and Ephraim, both of the lords in general grow independently, but the lords of FE7 grow as a trio.
Yeah, that's a good point, since Erica and Ephraim are separated for a good majority of the game, wherein the FE7 lords are, all together for the whole thing. And you can definitely see how their growth is influenced by each other. Like that yelling at Helene definitely is much more of a Hector Lynn thing, but Elliot was definitely influenced.
That's definitely a good distinction. And then when you see
Lynn yelling at, and she acts like she hates Hector, like, oh my god, you're such a brute, you're a total barbarian, that whole attitude Lynn has towards Hector. And then in the end, when she cries for him, she leans her head on his shoulder, and she more or less tells him, if you can't cry, let me do it for you. And I think it's such an incredible example of the emotional ties that the characters end up having for each other.
Now that you think of it, I was reminded of a scene, I think it's somewhere early on in the game, where Hector's trying to get information from this old woman, and Eliwood's kind of chiding him for it. That's sort of an example of, Eliwood's diplomacy actually being the better route to take.
Yeah, I think I remember that. And then the scene with Merlinus.
Yeah, with Merlinus.
We don't need peddlers, just F off. Eliwood, Hector, that's not how you talk to people.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so yeah, it is sort of that balance and interplay coming into balance. It's just, Hector's good. Hector's personality is good for some situations. Eliwood is good for others. You kind of have to balance it.
Yeah, they all balance each other very, very well.
Exactly. That's the story of the game. We are better together. No individual can complete a balance necessary to fully approach, the world and be a good part of humanity, but we make our humanity greater by forging connections and by committing to reach out to other people. And when you have these three people who are kind of three corners of a totally opposite triangle, like, they come together and they make each of the others better people just by the fact of working together.
So, I just realized I haven't really answered the question, what plot point in Blazing Sword spoke out to me. So, I was actually thinking about this question, and what was kind of interesting to me is, it wasn't necessarily one plot point, it was sort of a series of plot points, but sort of building on the same theme. I think a lot of it too, a lot of the scenes were just the ones that were pushing Eliwood or Hector's resolve. So, a major arc of the first part of the game is Eliwood's trying to find his father. Then what happened? Then they get to the drag. Then they find his father, and then what happens? Albert dies. And then there's the Eliwood and Ninian scene where he gets Durandal, he misuses his power, he thinks he's just killing a random dragon. Oh, by the way, guess what? That was Ninian. She's dead. And then there was also the scenes with Hector and Uther. And I think what spoke out to me about what these scenes are is that they push the hero's resolve, is that even when, crap is tough and times are getting down, you need to push through it. And even with personal problems, you just need to find the resolve to keep moving forward. I think that's what's because it really hit them home, and you can tell how it hits them home. But it's also just admirable that they're able to take their punches. The story is good at giving the heroes, some very gut punch moments, and then it manages to tell them, hey, you just got kicked in the balls, but you can move forward. You can become stronger, and you need to do this.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking something similar back when John was talking about the themes of the game, and it ties in with that, and also with the theme of connections between people. I've always thought one of the themes that Fire Emblem 7 does well is the idea of how people respond to loss. And it definitely ties in with what you just said, obviously with Hector losing his brother and Eliwood losing his father, but I think you see it a lot with some of the more minor players as well that have similar situations. Like Nino essentially losing everyone she's ever known, her quote-unquote brothers, the Reed brothers, Brendan, who's been like a father to her kind of, and just how it really just kind of, it doesn't end everything for her. It's a point where then she has to make the decision of, do I give up or do I keep fighting for what's right? And she keeps fighting. Or I was also, my part that I was going to talk about for the point in Blazing Sword that spoke to you the most, of course, is Leela's death. And how Matthew has a line that I absolutely love, where if you deploy him on that map after her death, and Hector's all like, you don't have to do this. I realize you're obviously in a lot of pain right now. And Matthew says, if Leela knew I was shirking my duties, she would never have forgiven me. I'm fine. I will work twice as hard for Ostia in her honor. And then after Hector leaves, then he says, tell me, Leela, this is what you'd want, right? You wouldn't want me to give up. I'll mourn for you when our battle is won. I must fulfill my duties, so rest. I promise I will take care of everything.
Yeah, that's powerful. I think moments like that, I think every moment in which, someone is tested really just brings me back to that theme where as soon as some critical loss happens in your life, right? The road branches. Just as Fire Emblem 7 says, the road is always branching. You can choose to deal with that loss by turning inward, like Nurgle does, or you can choose to deal with that loss by connecting to everyone else. And the really just encouraging and amazing scenes of people rallying in the face of just horrible loss, when we have Eliwood recovering from seeing his dad die, when we have Matthew recovering from seeing Layla die, they choose to connect with what they have left. Matthew, in the line you just said, his first thought is Ostia. That who is who cares for me. That is who I'm going to help for now. And Eliwood says, let's pick up and move on with the adventure because that's what my dad would have wanted. It's that choice to connect with other people that makes those scenes so really powerfully moving to me. And we also get examples of people like Nurgle who turn the other way and who say, no, it's all about indulging what myself feels and making myself more perfect and forgetting the outside world, brushing away the dragons and people that did me wrong. And that is that choice that Fire Emblem 7 keeps reminding us we are constantly making it. And I think I think it's refreshing and encouraging when we see people making that choice to connect rather than to sever ties.
Speaking of characters who dealt with loss, I also thought about Harkin. He's another example of a minor character who lost so much and it affected him. He was right there with Albert's knights, and he ultimately failed to protect his lord. And that's a huge part of his backstory and characterization. He's sort of like, I think TV Trope called it the failed knight or the Knight of Sorrows. Just this knight who failed at something and then has to carry around this burden. And then he has to deal with that, and he has to deal with that sense of loss, and he has to pick up and move on.
You could probably say the same about Fiora as well.
Oh yeah,
that's
when
right.
when her fellow Pegasus Knights are slaughtered by the Dread Isles, and then in her supports with Pent, where he offers to to pay reparations to the families of her fallen comrades, something like that.
I don't actually remember. I know I've gotten those, but
let's see here. With Pent.
Hey, Guy,
Yeah.
what plot point in Blazing Sword spoke out to you most?
Ooh. That is an excellent question. I'm gonna go with the Battle Before Dawn. The attempt on Zephiel's life by Nino and Jafar. And the reason
I was loving that one
Gepti.
meme. Oh, go ahead.
Now, what are you gonna say?
It was just a quick comment. I always love that one meme that's like, what your favorite Fire Emblem game says about you. And there's one for Fire Emblem 7 that says, you have a love-hate relationship with Battle Before Dawn.
It's just love on my end, but okay.
I think that's pretty true. Well, go on.
Well, I have mixed feelings on how the chapter is designed, but the point of it, I like a lot. I like Nino recognizes that there's this cycle of hate and slaughter, just going over and over and over again. And she decides she's not going to have anything to do with it. She's going to put it into it. She is not going to take the life of this innocent child. And she sees Zephiel's situation and realizes that's what she's going through. She does everything she can to be loved and accepted by who she thinks is her mother. And nothing is ever enough. And she sees Zephiel here just trying everything he can to get his father to love him, and it just doesn't work. So she says, I'm not doing this. You can kill me if you want to. I'm not going to kill this child. And then Jafar has a bit of a realization himself and decides, screw this, we're getting out of here, we're not doing this. So I love that they recognize that there's a problem, that there's this cycle going on and on and on. And they put a stop to it. They are the ones who stand up and say, this is not right, we're not going to do this.
Yeah, it takes a lot of guts on their part to turn away from the people you know and care about and say, yeah, no, this ain't gonna happen.
And especially since turning their backs on the Black Fang, I believe Jafar knows that turning their backs on them would mean their own death.
Yep.
because that's just kind of how they've been dealing. They deal with people who abandon ship.
Or at the very least, the loss of their family, right?
Yeah, the loss of their family or their lives. Either way, they're losing something if they turn away.
Right. Guy, you have picked one of my favorite chapters in the whole series, so props to that. I think I always saw the Nino and Jafar moments in Zephiel's bedroom is really strong to me for all of those reasons. I think it's yet another expression of the theme. Nino goes in with one objective, and she sees a connection between Zephiel and herself. And in that moment, she makes a choice to connect with someone else that other person doesn't even realize. Zephiel is never aware of the existence of Nino, but Nino chooses in that moment to connect with him as a person and to say, I value your humanity more than whatever I can give. And it's not because Jafar wants to be a better person, it is through the sheer force of Nino throwing that out there into the world. It's the sheer power of Nino's choice to just connect with other elements of humanity and spread love rather than turning within herself. Like, that is the moment where her road forks, and she so strongly chooses that connection fork in the road that Jafar can't help but be brought along with it. Like, he has never expressed any desire up to that point to, like, care for other people, but in that moment he does. In that moment, so strong is Nino's decision that he's just like, you know what? Okay, I have no other choice but to do this. We're leaving. I think that speaks volumes to the power of the choice to subrogate yourself to society. It just speaks volumes to the power of that choice to transform other people into better versions of themselves.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else have anything to add, or can we move on?
I'm good with us moving on.
All right. So the favorite characters section.
Hey Grant, before we move on, can I make one more quick note?
Go ahead.
It's going to be really quick, promise. So, the other thing I think Fire Emblem 7 gets right with its narrative is just how well it's written. Like, the writing is excellent. If y'all out there listening take any one thing away from this podcast, I would have it be this name, Alexander O. Smith. He's one of the translators of this game. His work is, at least I find it to be, just reliably excellent. He's such a good writer. He is so able to take stuff that was originally in Japanese and turn it into a story that sings. So, remember him. He translated Fire Emblem 7. It's really good. That's all I gotta say. Let's move on to characters.
All right. So I'm up first with Pence. I think the reason why I like Pence so much is that he's a very different kind of character than what we normally see in Fire Emblem. He's a rich guy with morals. And he's also in the sort of the mentor. He also plays a mentor role, but he doesn't die either. He's just a very well-off, very rich dude he's basically set for life, and he in the end chooses to be helpful and useful to the rest of the cast. I even briefly went over his support conversations in preparation for this, and it's sort of interesting which supports bring out which elements of Pence's personality. For example, his support conversation with Urk, he talks about how Urk's using too much magic, and you really shouldn't have done that. He gets mad at him, but he also is trying to teach him a lesson, which I thought was pretty cool. There's also the support with the B support with Canis or Canas. Gives me very FMA vibes because it's talking about people who are in pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of power, trying to prevent it from corrupting. It goes back to that theme of, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. and we get to see that with the Pent and Canis support, because they're both characters that are, have a big part of their personality as being hungry for knowledge, expanding and learning their magic in a similar way that alchemists are very driven to pursue knowledge of alchemy. And I think it was cool because Pent gets to have power, but then chooses to value his humanity. So, to sum it up, I guess this is an interesting example of a rich guy who's well off, who uses his wealth to help other people, like Fiora. He actively pursues power, just doesn't sit on his rear end, and he's not a stuffy noble either. So that's another cool element of his character.
Yeah, he was a character that I always felt like I didn't really appreciate when I was younger and I played the game, but that when I came back to it in more recent years, he really stood out to me as a pretty interesting character in that regard, for the same reasons you just said.
I like Pent a lot for a different reason. I tend to like seeing, in Fire Emblem, I guess it's kind of rare because characters are so young and supposed to be so marriageable. You don't really see many happy, functioning, married people in really any Fire Emblem. I really like how Pent is one. Pent and Louise have a great dynamic. It's so obvious that they care for each other so much, and it's always a joy to see them just in each other's presence, being good people towards each other and the world.
Yeah, Pent and Louise are among one of the few pairings of canon pairings of characters that are where things are just going well for them, and they're happy and in love. Off the top of my head, I think the only other one I can think of, just in a moment's notice, would probably be Quan and Evelyn in FE4.
I was gonna say Clive and Matilda as well.
Yeah, I love them too. Someone in chat also brought up Zealot.
But the first two sets of married people that I think of when I think of canon pairings are Quan and Evelyn, and Pent and Louise.
It's kind of sad, though, when you think about it, that the examples of stable, happy marriages is so relatively few and far between.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that's unintentional, though. I think that's usually done because these games are trying to portray, the negative sides to the world.
Yeah.
So, but it does work as a great contrast when we have a couple like Pent and Louise that are happily married, and they talk like a modern couple would. Like Louise, I forget exactly where it is. I think it's in one of her supports. She tells the story of how she came to marry Pent and how all of these ladies were after him, and she was like, "Oh God, I'm never gonna, he's never gonna pick me." But then he does, because she goes in with her bow and says, "I can protect you." They have such an awesome mutual protection aspect to them, I guess you would call it. I don't know a better way to phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
And can we talk about how badass Louise is for a second for fighting on the Dread Owl while she's pregnant?
Yes, we can.
Oh, I love that.
Can we talk about that?
It's most pregnant women, and especially back then, you're pregnant, you're not doing jack shit. You're staying home in a dark room for 9 months. But Louise is out there, guns a-blazing, shooting down, flipping fire dragons and bandits, and oh man, she is such a BA. She's great, I love her.
Shameless self-plug for 2 seconds. I'm not going to spoil what it is, but one of the many stories that I have jotted down had a lady like that, and I did that before I even realized I knew anything about Pent and Louise, because I never paid them attention until relatively recently. And I love that. It's such a cool idea. just in general. And I love, like you said, Louise is out there like shooting down professional Wyvern riders, shooting up the fire dragon. Oh, I love it. And she's so nonchalant about it when she tells Pent too. She's just like, yeah, I'm gonna protect you and our unborn baby that I have inside me right now. Like, how do you respond to that?
Though I find the idea of her protecting him kind of hilarious, given their stats in game.
Yeah, seriously.
Oh yeah, there was one other little humorous thing. I remember on a Serenus Forest.net forum, this one person was like, I think Pent's the first example of a DILF we see in the series.
Is he?
It's okay. You know what? She can protect Pent though because she's bowlocked, so that means the enemies are more likely to attack her on enemy phase.
Oh, and something in the comments too. If Pent or Luis dies, the other leaves to make sure they don't die. So that's a very Quan and Ethlin type thing.
Yup.
Yeah.
I was gonna point that out. Glad you did, because yeah, I like that. I like Pent and Louise a lot. That I'm realizing this, and I guess this will come up when it's my turn to talk about my character. But most of the characters in this game, I really, really enjoy, but I never really talk about them, and I don't really know why that is.
Because they're all so well written. So
I kind of feel the same way about the character that I want to talk about. He's a character that I love, but he's just not one that I talk about often.
Well, at least for me, like
I
always
talk about the one that I picked.
I always talk about the Kaga era games. I always talk about Holy War. I always talk about Thracia. I talk about Gaiden. But you don't usually hear me talk about Sacred Stones or Blazing Blade, even though I love both of these games. It's just, I don't know, I just never really talk about them much. I don't know why. Let's move on. I'm going to stop rambling.
Speaking of moving on, Guy, do you want to just go next?
I can,
know the
but
podcast is differently,
I thought it was Marissa's turn.
Well, I mean, it does feel more organic at this point to have you do it, since you just talked about how you don't get to talk about it, so here's your chance.
Okay, so as Grant and John, actually I think everybody here, I don't know why I'm pointing people out, can attest, I had some trouble picking somebody to talk about. Because like I just said, I had the realization, I really like most of these characters, but I've never really gone in depth on a lot of them and talked about why I like them, because I'm always talking about someone else from another game that I love even more. So here I settled on Priscilla. The thing, we've been talking about how this game pushes this idea of loss, how people go through loss and they grow from it in however they, whichever way. They look inward or outward or however. So here we have Priscilla, who was born to a noble house, but because of corruption, that house was destroyed and she got adopted by a different noble in a different country. That kind of thing. Sorry, my mom is talking to somebody. She's distracting me.
Mom strats out of 10.
So when we meet Priscilla, I'm sorry, I'm getting so distracted right now. When we meet Priscilla, Elwood and company have saved her, and she joins the party, and later we run into her brother, Raven, although that wasn't his name when he was her brother, and I like their supports because a lot of people kind of feel weirded out by Priscilla because she's one of the troubadours in the series that has this weird fascination with her brother. And a lot of people don't like that. The thing with Priscilla is she was separated from him when they were kids. She hasn't known him, and they had this weird game when they were kids. But she, is still young, she's still immature, and she's clinging on to this, so she's like, brother, you gave me this ring when we were kids. You said you would take me as your bride. I'm not leaving you. And she fusses at him for being stubborn, and she brings him out of his shell. Because he's Raven. Spoiler alert, someone else is going to talk about Raven later, but
it's me.
Their supports, their dynamic is interesting because Raven is so focused on the negativity in his life. He's so focused on revenge for his noble house getting destroyed that he's changed his name, he does mercenary work. This is all he cares about. And Priscilla, with a lot of immature fussing and begging, coaxes him out of his shell, and he finally says, okay, you know what? You're right. I wasn't thinking straight. I'm gonna, let's go on our adventure and you can stay by my side. And another thing with Priscilla that ties into this overall theme in this game of loss and dealing with it, Priscilla has 4 romantic pairings, but 3 of them don't end in marriage. 3 of them are tragic. She gets left behind because the guy has some irreconcilable difference. She can't marry, I think it's Heath, Guy, and Sane are the 3.
Heath. And Heath, Guy,
yeah,
and Sane.
It's Heath, Guy, and Sane.
Yeah.
So, and it's been a while since I've played the game and read all these supports, so I have them up in front of me, so I'm just kind of scrolling through while I talk about it. Just a second.
No worries.
Would now be a good time to get Raven on the table as well, so we can kind of talk about how he and Priscilla work off each other?
All right, Alessia, that's you.
All right. So, as I was saying, I love Raven as a character, but he's not a character I get the chance to talk about often. But the reason I want to talk about him was because when I was thinking about all the other points I wanted to bring up during this podcast, just like we've all kind of mutually decided with the main theme being loss, is the way Raven grows and develops after the losses that he's suffered. Because, as Guy was just saying, he's changed his name and he's doing mercenary work, and so many people look at Raven and they think, oh, this is just Mr. King Edgelord. He's the angry, resentful, revenge seeker, 90s action protagonist kind of character. And so he gets written off a lot by people in the community, but I think he's such an interesting character to talk about because of the way he ends up growing through talking with various people in the story of Fire Emblem 7, such as Lucius and Priscilla. Because, like I was just saying, with the way with his conversations with Priscilla and their supports, she pushes to the point where he ends up kind of breaking and deciding that he doesn't want to carry on seeking the revenge that he wanted to seek. And he realized the mistakes he was making because in the pain of losing his family, he was trying to push away the last living blood-related person that he had, which is Priscilla. And she makes him realize that he shouldn't be pushing her because she's all he has left, aside from Lucius, who's blood-related. And in the conversation that he has with Lucius, we see Raven almost have a full breakdown because he's yelling at Lucius to leave because he doesn't want Lucius to get hurt or he doesn't want Lucius to die, but breaks in the A support. Whenever I read the A support between those two, I almost imagine Raven almost in tears. And then it goes from almost crying to joking around about how Raven's just gonna give up his revenge plot, and Lucius making jabs at him saying you should get married, but Raven's saying, no, I have enough people jabbering at me already. It's such a fun support conversation, because we really get to see that side of a character who was coming across as so hard and so focused on a goal. And just seeing them just shatter before our eyes.
Yeah, it's when I said before that one of the themes that I think Fire Emblem 7 plays with best is how people respond to loss. Then both Priscilla and Raven are definitely on the radar for that issue. And it's interesting with them being siblings and having suffered the same loss of their family, how they respond to it in very different ways. With Priscilla responding by basically clinging to what she has left, her brother, and by Raven focusing on getting revenge. But then him, as John was saying before, with how people are in Fire Emblem 7 are changed by their connections with other people, and how Raven is able to warm up again after spending time with Priscilla again.
Yeah, and he realizes that the way he's been dealing with his pain is toxic. It's a realization he comes to after talking to Priscilla and Lucius, and I think that's so important, because so many people, when they suffer these hard losses and lose people they care about, don't deal with it well. And sometimes it takes a really stern talking to for them to come out of it. And I think that Raven is a very good example of this.
For sure. I think thematically it's that crossroad that the rest of the entire game is all about, right? They go up to the point of living a happy life until their family and their noble house just falls apart. And the choice is, as every choice in Fire Emblem 7 is, either take the path of connection to other people, or take the path of moving inward and turning only to yourself. And we have one that does one, and one that does the other. And I think that brings out precisely what the theme is talking about. Priscilla turns to the only connections she really has left in this life, while Raven's reaction is just, hey, you know what? I need to do what I need to do for myself to be a full man again, and I'm going to push away the entire rest of the world in furtherance of what I need to be, thinking selfishly. And I think it's a testament, once again, to the power of connection with other people, that Raven is set to go down that road. He's heading down that road. He's gonna get his revenge against Ostia, and then Priscilla shows up on the scene, and by the sheer force of her welcoming and attempt to connect, pulls Raven off of choice number 2 back onto the road of choice number 1, and is able to reroute his entire future. I think it's the theme in a nutshell, yet again.
Another note.
Sorry, go ahead.
This is just a minor note. Is something that I always kind of wished was there. Is I've always wished that Raven had a support conversation with someone from Ostia. Probably Matthew or Oswin. I'm not exactly sure what route it would take, but I just think it could be really interesting to see them actually interact. Because he doesn't actually talk to anyone from Ostia.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, actually, and I'm glad you brought that up. Another interesting support of his, even though I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this one, but when I was looking over his supports to see what ones I wanted to talk about, I noticed his support chain with Rebecca, of all people. Because when people think about Raven being a nice guy, they think of his conversations with Priscilla and Lucius. And we know from those conversations that Raven has the potential to be a really sweet, kind-hearted guy beneath that tough exterior. But then we get a glimpse of how he's able to interact with others when he's talking to Rebecca, where he's kind of able to sit down and listen to her, and he's able to just be really kind and nice when she's feeling hurt about losing her brother. He's sitting there and he's listening and he's helping her repair her bowstring, and he's just doing all these great things to try and cheer her up. And I think that's a really picture of.
You there? Hello.
Anyways.
So does anyone else have anything to add before we I guess move on. No? Okay. Marisa, why don't you go up next?
All right. Well, you guys said before that the characters are talking about this for are characters that you don't necessarily talk about often, and for me, Matthew is by far my favorite character, not just in Fire Emblem 7, but in all of Fire Emblem. So I talk about him a lot with a lot of people. Actually, recently, a couple of my friends and I made lists of our top 10 favorite fictional characters of all time, and Matthew is number 3 on my list. Like, I just love him so much, and I could go on about him all day, but I'll try not to. So, I love Matthew for a lot of reasons. Part of it is just his outward personality. I love characters that have that kind of cheeky, sardonic, carefree personality. It just cracks me up. Like, everything he says makes me laugh or smile. Some of the specific examples from different supports or parts in the story is, I love in the chapter where you get Lynn back in Elliewood or Hector's Tale, that he and Lynn have a conversation in which he tries to convince her that they've never met before. And that just always made me laugh. And then I love in his supports with Hector, when he tricks Hector into carrying around extra food in case he gets hungry on the battlefield. Or how he introduces himself as a master of acquisitions of all kinds, to which Lynn replies, "You're a thief." So like he just has so many lines that I just think are so clever and funny, and that just makes me enjoy him all the time. But then at the same time, I love the fact that he has a much more serious side as well, which you see in a lot of different parts in the story and also in supports. Like in his supports with Guy, how he kind of he really challenges Guy, always going around being like, I want to be the world's greatest swordsmaster, and Matthew's like, you realize that's going to be hard, right? That's really easy to say, but that's really not going to happen that easily. So he has a very realistic side. But then I also feel like he has a great deal of wisdom, which very much underlies his more carefree exterior. Like, when he acknowledges how Leela wouldn't want him to give up, that she would want him to keep going, as I already said before. Also, in his supports with Jafar, how he realizes that that Leela would actually not want him to take revenge for her death by killing someone else, like Nito. And so he backtracks on that, and I just feel like you see a lot of very wise moments from him like that. I also really like, this is such a more minor thing, but just the regret that you see from him, where when he originally talks to Leela, he mentions bringing her back to his hometown so she can meet his parents. And then after they find her dead, he says that he was going to ask her to leave this life behind with him, but he waited too long. And I just think that moment of reflection and regret is really well done.
I like Matthew a lot. To kind of contrast the seriousness, because this is a very serious, emotionally heavy game. One of my favorite moments that I think of when I think of Matthew is where he recruits Guy, and he's just like, "Hey, I fed you that one time, and you said you owed me your life. So can you come hang out with us?" And Guy gets so mad.
Yeah, and then he uses the Cicaans never lie thing against Guy.
Yup.
I love that. Matthew, I love how Matthew's just so I love how intelligent of a character he is. He finds ways to use words against people, and it's great.
Absolutely. A friend of mine and I were talking the other day about how he's definitely a little bit of a troll.
A little bit?
Yeah, really. And you see that all throughout his supports with Guy, too. All throughout them, where he's just he's like, what can I make you do next? You owe me one favor for each piece of meat. So let's see what I can have you do.
I think what I like, why Matthew stands out to me as a guy I like and identify with so much, is because he's such an excellent judge of character, right? As a player, as you're going through this game, you're forming opinions about every single character you come across. By the time Matthew starts opining on people like Sarah, you have a clear thought of who she is and what you feel about her. And then Matthew just, like, straight up says exactly what you're thinking every time. Like, he reads people as well as you, as a player of the game, read people. I think that's why he's just so likable, is because you find, yep, this guy gets it. He gets it like I've been getting it for the past, hours playing this game. I think that might be why the connection's there.
There's definitely a lot of points where you see that too, like even in his judgment in Lynn's Tale, where if you send him to that one house and he'll have a conversation with Hector, and he basically just explains the entire situation to Hector as you, the player, see it. How Lundgren's really greedy and awful, so if Ostia is going to support anyone, we should probably stick with Lynn.
Yeah, and to be totally honest, I think Matthew's probably one of my favorite members of the Julian archetype, because a lot of other early game thieves in the series are really generic and boring. Like, you see Colm in Fire Emblem 8, and he just kind of feels like your generic thief guy,
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of feel that way about Dew as well in FE4.
Chad.
Yeah,
Chad, oh my god, don't even get me started on Chad.
I know literally
I
nothing
do not
about
like Chad. He just exists and he looks like Naruto.
Oh, he does. Wow.
He looks.
I'm never gonna
my God.
unsee
Now I
that
can't
now.
unsee that.
I'm never gonna
Yes, thank
unsee
you.
that.
Now we'll all have to see that from now on.
Sorry,
Everyone-
sorry guys.
And I do not like Naruto as a character. Gosh.
I don't even like Naruto, but I just can't help but see Naruto whenever I look at Chad, and I can't even put a personality to his face. And Colm either. I can't really put a personality to Colm other than I'm gonna steal things because I'm a bad guy and I'm not a nice man and I like to steal things. That's that's kind of how a lot of thieves in the series are. But Matthew's he's snide and he's snarky and he tells it like it is.
And he's technically not a thief as far as his actual profession goes either. He's technically a spy. He just has a thief's skill set.
Yeah.
So it definitely makes sense that he would be different from a lot of the thieves in the series.
I do actually agree with you, because now that I think about it, most thieves aren't really all that interesting. I mean, I like Volk from a personality standpoint, but even then, it does feel like Matthew is the reigning champion of thieves in terms of personality. Yeah, his cheerful and sarcastic side is always nice. It's real. Especially for a thief, too, because a lot of thieves and assassins are just like, oh, I'm going to kill things, or oh, I'm going to steal things, and Matthew's like, hey, Sarah's annoying.
Yeah, I think
Now
my
that I
favorite
can agree
thieves
with.
are Matthew and Rennick.
Oh, I love how he talks to Sarah all throughout their supports, and how she's when she's telling him about how Hector's not listening to her because she went up to Hector and started demanding that he give her some vassals, and Matthew's kind of like, I think I get what you're saying here, because I also had a request recently for Hector, and he also completely ignored me. And she's like, oh yeah, what was it? And he's like, well, there's a certain distraction that I've noticed recently that isn't leaving me alone, and I asked for that distraction to be removed, and he ignored me completely. And Sarah's just, so oblivious she has no idea he's talking about her.
Yeah, I
That
still
part
think the
was funny.
funniest thing, though, is that Matthew and Sarah have a paired ending together, and I just think that's hilarious, because he hates her guts.
Yeah, that one, I just,
I don't like it, but I think it's funny.
I actually do like Sarah, but as a romantic option for Matthew, no. I don't see it at all.
Yeah, I'm with Marissa on this one. It's funny you talk about that. I'm actually looking at their supports right now. Something that sticks out to me is their C support. I've been wondering about this. Are you really one of Elamine's clerics? Are you sure you're not actually the follower of some dark, evil god?
She follows Locktier's annoying cousin.
There we go.
So yeah, Matthew, hilarious guy, deserves his popularity. Great pick.
Very good pick.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, John, I believe you're...
Hey, it's my turn. So, I was originally planning to discuss Nurgle in this point, because I love me some compelling villains, but we've done that quite a bit already, so with y'all's permission, let's talk about one of the leads. I want to talk about Lynn.
Yes.
Full disclosure, I had the biggest thing for Lynn in college, but my appreciation of her character has grown far beyond that. I've spoken already at a bit of length about how each of the three leads is a flawed but necessary part of a group. Lynn's particular character points are that she is honest and proud, both to a fault. Her weakness and her strength particularly relate to that storied Sasaean honesty, where, you know, sometimes you can always count on her to say what she means. Sometimes she is needlessly and brutally to the point. And her pride similarly propels her to do some great, unbelievable things, and at other times leads her to just totally rebuff conversations that ought to happen. But what I find particularly compelling about Lynn in relation to all of the rest of this is because it's her role that really makes the three leads fit together the most. Hector and Ellawood are best buddies otherwise and have been for a long time, but they don't see eye to eye about much of anything. Lynn provides kind of the middle ground. She makes that sense of fellowship and belonging really click. It's her honesty that brings people together, and the passion of her pride, I guess, towards her heritage and towards what she feels like needs to get done that really brings everyone together onto a common course. And that's how they can do these great things together. Lynn herself, in relation to Ellawood and Hector, is really a demonstration of that central theme. I like particularly how that trademark honesty also reflects in the relationship she has with, of all people, the tactician. I like that a lot. When, of the three people that turn to the camera and start talking to you, which are the three leads, you get the feeling that Ellawood's maybe softballing you sometimes. You get the feeling that Hector is totally dismissive of you, and he's like, oh, yeah, hey, what's up? Time to get back to the action. Lynn, however, when she turns to the camera, will always tell it to you just like she sees it. When she says she's glad for your company, you know she absolutely means it. And therefore, like, in those moments when she turns to the camera, starts talking to the tactician, I really feel like somehow it really adds something to the story, even if the tactician is otherwise kind of a forced addition onto the set. And the other point that came to mind, and then I'll be quiet and let you offer your opinions, is I think it's pretty cool that Lynn... Fire Emblem has always been interested in making, powerful, interesting women ever since the beginning when we had good old Cheda of Talus. Lynn...
The OG waifu.
the OG waifu, yes. You could call her that. That's actually her royal title in Talus. I think...
Sure.
I think it interesting, particularly in the context of Lynn, that she is forced to and does combat sexism and sexual harassment more often and more assertively than, 90% of video game women. If you reading through the story again, as I did in preparation for this discussion, I found that, just left and right, men are calling her beautiful every other chapter. They're making remarks about women on the battlefield, and it's just Lynn is constantly in the headlights of this. Every single time, people are making passes at her. And what I really admire about her is that she keeps a super strong front against this. Fire Emblem 7 is constantly catcalling her, and even when she's clearly totally uncomfortable about it, she knows how to react in every given situation. She will talk back to the people who need talking back, she will let fall the comments that need to be let fall, like when Fargus does it, and she will just consciously fight these battlefield stereotypes by just going out there and being really good with a sword in a fight. I particularly like how Lynn is forced to confront that and confronts that successfully time after time after time. That really speaks to her strength as a character.
Yeah, that's a really good point about her. They definitely address the issue of sexism more with Lynn than they feel like they do with most of the other major female leads in the series. Even other characters that have to overcome different obstacles, I feel like it's less connected to them being women than it is with Lynn sometimes. How she states when you first meet her, that's part of the reason that after her tribe was wiped out, and she said, no one would lead her, they wouldn't follow a woman. So yeah, you definitely see that a lot with her character. In a way that I don't, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like you don't really see that element come up with Kata or with Erica or Micaiah or any of the other female leads.
I don't think so. And particularly Lynn's reaction is important to me just because she keeps her head high and she's just like, it all just flows off her back. Like, none of that's important to her. She just keeps her focus on what's important, which is her friendship with her comrades in arms and the goal that's in front of her.
Mm-hmm.
I never paid too much attention to the sexism theme in this game, but I'm glad y'all pointed it out. It is there. It's just I never. The part that Lynn faces that I found a little more interesting is during her story. They touch on a little bit of racism and nationalism too, like how Lynn is kind of viewed by default as a less cultured, less civilized person because she's from the plains of Sakai. And I forget the boss's name, but it's the chapter where you meet Wrath, and he's working for this guy. And this guy won't help Lynn because, well, you're from Sakai, you're a savage, get the hell out of my kingdom. And then Wrath hears him, and then he's like, oh, no, Wrath, you're cool. I like you. And then Wrath is like, yeah, bullcrap.
Yeah, he says, as long as we bow our heads, then you're fine with us. But if we try to present ourselves as an equal, then
It's Marcus Arafin.
okay.
He doesn't have a name. He's
That's it.
referred to as Marcus Arafin.
Okay. Thank you. I couldn't remember where it was. I haven't played Blazing Blade in a long time. But...
I'm not racist. I have Psychian friends. See, I like this one guy.
Yeah, that's pretty much what that is. And that kind of reminds me of the time my cousin was playing Call of Duty, and he was like, I'm not racist, I have black friends. And the guy who said that to you turned out to be black. And I could hear the guy screaming at my cousin over the microphone.
Oh, jeez.
Over the microphone, so that kind of reminds me of that. Because it's the same thing.
I also liked your first point about how Lynn is connected to the tactician in a way that most of their characters aren't. I get that feel really strong every time I start up Fire Emblem 7. I feel like I'm going on an adventure with Lynn. I just love the image of how I think she calls you her genius tactician, and she'll be your peerless swords master. And
Yeah.
I just love the image of that at the very start.
I think I'll go ahead.
I hate admitting this a little bit, but when I played Awakening, for when you get Lynn as a DLC character and she recognizes you, I actually cried. Like, I was so happy that it's like Lynn knows me. She recognizes me as her tactician from all those years ago. So yeah, I really agree with that. That bond feels very strong.
Right, and of course she would be the one to do that because she is all about bringing the team together, reaching out. That main theme of Fire Emblem 7, that's entirely her deal. Of course she would be the one to recognize you in Awakening. It makes so much sense. It's perfect.
Granted, Ellie Wood and Hector are not actually DLC characters in Awakening, but yeah,
Right.
Lynn definitely would be the one of the three.
I also like Lynn's story a great deal. We can talk about this later in the gameplay section, how it feels in that respect, but I really enjoy how Lynn's story is a self-contained character arc for her. She develops as a person, and we really see her come to interact with the world in a new way. I think that's part of why she forms the solid bond with the tactician that she does, is because she grows so much in the company of the tactician that they've kind of been there together through this formative moment in both of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree
I
that I
like
like
her story a lot, mostly because it's very small scale and very personal to her. And I think, like you said, it really, lays the groundwork for who she is. And a lot of people criticize her for kind of taking a backseat to Elwood and Hector when the focus shifts to their story. But I think we've touched on pretty well that the trio kind of needs her to stick together. Like I feel like Elwood and Hector would both be lesser if Lynn wasn't there.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, like I've always been kind of neutral on her, but I do accept the fact that she really does complete that trio as it is.
All right. Well, does anyone else have anything to add, or can we move to the next point? All right. I'll take that as a cue to move on. So the next one will be. So the next point we were going to talk about were the support conversations and what influence and impact they had on our perception of these characters. I think. I think the thing I love about the support conversations is that they help to develop and flesh out characters who normally wouldn't get a lot of screen time. And I think for me, some of the ones for Blazing Sword that stand out are Legault's supports. Legault, he's not really a character that's very important, but his backstory is so dang interesting because he used to work for the Black Fang. He was a big deal once upon a time, and then he's like, "Yeah, screw you guys, screw Nurgle, I'm out of here." That was a really cool moment, and you don't get that through the story. That's all through supports. Another one that kind of stuck out was Harkins for reasons we've talked about already. The failed knight who has to live with his regret and his shame. Again, all through the supports. I think the supports also help to humanize Hector and show that there's more to him than just being an axe-swinging barbarian. Because I'm particularly thinking of his supports with Lynn, where he's talking about his parents and how that affected them growing up, and how Oswin just sort of had to be the big brother and take and just how Oswin sort of had to take up the mantle of leadership. And so that really helped me to like Hector a little bit more.
I think the support conversations in general, particularly for Hector's side, are some of the best support conversations that the series have ever had. I think they develop and make more likable every character, even characters that without them I might not feel so kindly towards, such as, for example, Hector or Sarah. And there are people on this podcast who like Hector and Sarah, and that's fantastic, and I think that is because we get to see more of them and more well-written detail that makes them sympathetic in these support conversations than we ever would from just seeing them, go out onto the battlefield and meet the army.
Yeah, I agree. The way Fire Emblem 7 handles its supports in general is probably the best that we've had in the entire series. Because, I thought about this one a lot, and I've thought about a lot of things in this podcast a lot, but in terms of the supports, I realized that they use world building to their advantage when they develop the characters through supports. They talk about things that you don't see on the surface. They, unlike the 3DS Fire Emblem games, and I'm not hammering on them, I'm just using them as an example, but the 3DS Fire Emblem games, you see so many instances of, this is my backstory, I did this, this, and this happened to me in this way, and then it just repeats itself over and over and over in basically the exact same way. And then you get character development that contradicts each other. And again, not hammering on the 3DS Fire Emblem games, but in Fire Emblem 7, they handle the character development really well. Like, they reference places, and they reference events, and they reference their relationships to other characters. And, like, for example, in Florin and Ninian's conversations, you wouldn't think of any real connections between these two characters, but they talk about their favorite, or Ninian's favorite flower, which you find growing in a lone little mountain in the back ends of Avelia. You see conversations with, again, Raven, and then him talking about his past with Priscilla. You see Pent and Urk, and they're talking about how much Urk has grown, or Pent and Louise and Urk, and you see how much Pent and Louise have noticed Urk growing as a person since, he came into their care. There's just so much care and detail that's put into the supports and characterizing these people that we see in the game.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I also consider Blazing Sword to have the best supports in the series, and for a number of reasons. One of them is also as a comparison to the 3DS games, is they always just feel kind of samey after a while. I think in part because there's just so many of them, it's really hard to take the time to come up with a kind of a narrative for each support that doesn't feel like just two personality traits conflicting with each other the whole time, or bouncing off each other. Wherein the supports in Fire Emblem 7 to me are extremely varied, just in the way that there's a good mix of characters that already have a relationship with each other, and with characters that are meeting for the first time, like you said, Florina and Ninian is a good example. So it's just like every time I start a new support chain in Fire Emblem 7, I'm always starting it being like, oh, I wonder what these two characters are going to talk about, or these characters already know each other, so I'm curious about what elements of their relationship we'll find out about, or these characters don't know each other already, at least not that I know of. So I'm curious to see what they will find in common. And then another thing that is really, really, I think, special about Fire Emblem 7 supports is there's a lot of hidden secrets that you find out about characters that you wouldn't get, like Grant said before about Legault's backstory, but also things like, one that stands out to me is the Will, Dart, and Rebecca support chains, how you find out about the fact that Dart is actually Rebecca's long-lost brother. And things like that I love, because it never touches on that in the main story, but by doing the supports you get to find out so much more, things that are really just hidden secrets that I feel like the other games don't really include in support conversations like that. Renault, of course, is another good example, where his supports gradually unlock his whole story.
Yeah, and it's never just a backstory dump, like you see a lot in Fates, for example, where Niles just dumps all his backstory on Camilla in like one conversation, and then you never hear about it again. I hated that. Sorry, just gonna throw that out there. But like the supports, yeah, they're not just backstory dumps. They detail little things about the characters. They detail little things about the world. They talk about, a lot of them talk about more than just the people involved, and I think that's a really good thing.
I think from a like technique standpoint, I think they're particularly well written for two reasons. The first is that in every conversation, someone is pursuing an objective, or rather both of them are pursuing an objective, but someone is trying to get something out of that discussion. And the other is that I think with the way supports are set up, what we want to see in any given storytelling, we want to see a character start somewhere at a place of a little bit lopsidedness, a little bit of discomfort, and travel in an arc throughout the narrative so that they end up having developed in some way. And I think the way that Fire Emblem 7 supports are set up, they're able to reach, like, the A support in every case is some development of at least one of the characters, usually both of the characters that are involved in that support, right? And so the fact that you can only travel to one A support for every character means that you essentially get to pick how that character is going to develop over the course of your given game. And I think that not only adds a little bit of authorship of like your experience over the game, but it also adds a lot about just the ability of these characters to grow, mature, and become really full three-dimensional people.
Funny you bring that up, because I was actually looking at some of Renault's supports, because I really do feel like Renault has some really good ones. Like where he's talking about Canis about the morphs. That one was a nice one. And then again, going back to what you guys were saying, you know, the backstories are very layered. You don't just get it dumped from one conversation. It's, oh, at this point in time in my life I did this thing, or at this point in my time in my life I did this thing. Because I'm looking at the A support with Canis and Renault, and Renault mentions, you know, when Nurgle first created his morphs, he wasn't alone. He had an assistant, and then Canis is like, "Oh, Bishop, are you saying this was a long time ago?" And it's like, "Oh, he kind of just said that he was the guy that was helping Nurgle." It's like, "Oh, wow."
Right?
And again, and the way it's done too, it's a lot more subtle, because I could see in a 3DS game, they're just like, "Oh, by the way, I did it, bye." And it's like, no, let's go through, let's back layer it piece by piece. Or even still, just the way that their backstories come out feels very organic too. Like Lucius and Renault, when Lucius is talking about how he was in an orphanage and he had a cruel teacher, it's like, oh, this is actually really, really nice. This feels like a really informative support piece.
And totally in line with their character too, right? I mean, in a less well-written game, one imagines Renault would come out with the revelation at the end. He's only been traveling with you for 2 chapters, but I was there when Nurgle created morphs. Haha, peace. But in this game, like, Renault just shows up as this mysterious, wandering dude. He says about 2 lines, and if you don't want to invest in him, that's all you get out of him. That's all you know of him. He's just this old guy who looks like he's seen some stuff. But then you dig deeper into him, and it turns out he's not telling you all this story that comes with him and all the travels that he's been through. So, like, I think it's entirely a character decision. That goes right back to how well this game is written. It's just like the character is first and foremost in mind when anybody in this game makes a decision. That is really, really good to read.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more subtlety to it than in some of the other games.
And another, actually, one of my favorite support chains in the series as a whole is probably the supports between Canis and Nino. Because we find out so many little subtle details, all because he decides he wants to teach her how to read. And because of that, we find out that she might be his niece. We find out that she has a twin brother. We found out so many little details about these characters through these support chains, just because the other character decides they want to do something to that, and it ends up making some sort of great impact on them.
Reaching out to connect with other people makes everybody more complete, you might say.
But it doesn't happen often. Like, a lot of supports in a lot of other games in the series don't really do that. They don't really show the characters reaching out to each other. They just see them walk into the support conversation and go, "This is the thing I did, this is the thing, another thing I did, this is the thing that happened to me, bye."
Mm-hmm. I think part of the strength of Fire Emblem 7s as well is, I said before, they're more varied. I think that's partially because they're not all just romantic supports. And that's not all the ones in the 3DS games, but it is a very large majority of them, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And in Fire Emblem 7, you can have 2 characters that are characters of the opposite sex that will have a conversation, and it's not actually a romantic one, like Lynn and Will, and they talk about basically about their families, or about Will's family, but they don't have a paired ending together. So the fact that not every single support conversation is about trying to get two characters to marry each other in a single in 3 conversations, I think really helps them be very different.
And the fact that they don't have to, and the fact that not every character has to talk with every character means that they don't have to find as many topics as possible to struggle.
Exactly.
And they're able to talk about their backstories and reach out to each other more effectively without being repetitive.
And that even adds like engagement on the menu, right? You see, like, if you see this carefully curated set of people they can possibly talk to, like there's a handful of people that you're like, oh yeah, they know each other, I wonder what they're going to talk about. Or, oh yeah, I really want to see these two people talk to each other because I think they've been in the periphery of each other. And there's always a handful of like surprise picks where it's like, oh wow, these two talk, what do they talk about? And like that, like even that just adds a little bit more of engagement into the whole system of being interested in figuring out who these people are.
Absolutely.
What do you think, Guy?
I don't really have anything to say that hasn't already been said. I think the supports, as a general thing, were a great addition to the Fire Emblem series, and I think my only problem that I have with the way supports work in the Game Boy Advance games isn't like the writing structure of them, because like you guys pointed out, they tend to be very varied and overall well done. My only problem is how much of a pain in the butt it is to actually see them in the game.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
That is...
Like, I remember first couple times playing Blazing Sword, I didn't even know support conversations were in the game until I accidentally got one between Lynn and Sane.
Oh, same thing.
And
I had no idea.
Yep.
And then when I tried to look it up, I couldn't find anything about it on the internet, so I was like, how the hell? So I was like freaking out, like, how do I get more of these?
This was one of those moments where it was really helpful for me to learn, like, by playing alongside my best friend White when it came out, because he was like, oh yeah, if you don't know about this, this is how you go about this. And I was like, that's great, because the game would never have told me that, so that's cool.
Yeah, I know my first one was between Eliwood and Hector, and they were just standing next to each other, and I was like, support? What's that?
And it's glowing green! What does it mean?
Where then Fire Emblem 8 comes right out and tells you exactly how to get characters to support each other with Naomi and Colm.
But
Which
yeah,
I think was a good
like,
thing
what
on
is
that-
this
on that
word?
part,
What is
though.
this word? That mysterious word that starts with an S. Oh, they take so long to get though. That's my only gripe with them.
Yeah, well, some take
Some of them
ridiculously
do.
long.
Some of them you get really fast, but a good portion of them take forever.
Which is especially hard for the characters that are really late game, like Ronald or Carla.
Oh
Yeah.
man,
that's-
getting Carlos supports is such a pain in the butt.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so
I
bad
still at
because
least
I like
feel
Carla.
like they pasted.
I think that
for sure.
for all the crap we've given the 3DS support, something I will say that I like about them is that they're a lot easier to get. So it's a lot easier to get more of them and to see that coming out.
Agreed. The 3DS
Definitely.
supports were made for you to get them all when you play it. I
Which I
I
personally
definitely
appreciate.
agree about that point.
I appreciate it because
Yeah.
I like what you guys said about
go ahead,
how
Guy.
not seeing all of them in one playthrough kind of, like, John, I think you were the one who said this, it kind of lets you have a little bit of authorship over how things unfold for the characters. But on the flip side of that, you can kind of see it as a little bit of a cheap limiter to try to encourage replaying the game to see everything, which I don't really like or think was necessary. If you look at it that way, I agree with you, the authorship thing is good. I just, personal preference, I like the way how the 3DS games let you get almost all of them in one go. Because then,
Nope, I'm totally behind you with that guy. I
it's-
think
it makes it a
as-
lot
oh, go
easier to get attached to the characters, I think. Like, well, with that system, I think. But I also think the 3DS system suffers a little bit from development... what's the term I'm looking for? Development resetting syndrome, I guess, because a lot of those supports cover similar things about the characters. And a lot of the
Yeah,
times
they,
you'll
a
have
lot
a
of them
character.
contradict each other.
Yeah, they do. Like a lot of the times in those games, or at least
Yeah.
mostly in Fates, not so much Awakening or Echoes, you'll have a character that'll, have some growth and development alongside this other character, and that's great. But then they talk to, someone else, and they're the same person you were when you met them. And the Game Boy Advance supports,
Yep.
I don't really know why I get this feeling. Maybe it's just because they're written better. The Game Boy Advance supports don't make me feel that way. That's not to say I don't love some of the 3DS characters, it's just, I think the system is flawed.
I think
A lot
part
of
of
them
it is
suffer because of the supports, yeah.
I think part of it is also just that there's so fewer supports in Fire Emblem in the Game Boy Advance games, so they don't need to be as repetitive.
Yeah, because
you can support literally anyone and everyone except for the Robin/Corn sexual characters, really just takes away from the game's ability to characterize everyone. Because eventually you're going to run out of things to write about if you do that. In a game of 40-something characters, if you can have everyone supported with each other, there's only so
Exactly.
much you can talk about.
I think that's right. I will also say I'm totally with Guy. As I've grown older, I find it more and more difficult just as a practical matter to find time in which I can, take up a game, play it through, then replay it again if I'm interested in finding, all the different ways in which one character talks to other people, or all the different elements of Nurgle's backstory. Like my practical ability to do that as I've grown older is less and less. So where I may have enjoyed that once upon a time in college, I think now I'm certainly of the camp that the more that's accessible to me in one playthrough, the better the designed that game may be.
Something else that also has come across is that sometimes, with inaccessible supports, it's that I tend to be rather particular for the kind of teams I build for, when I'm playing Fire Emblem. Usually I'm either because I usually have characters that I either think are just straight up good and can wreck enemies, or characters that I like, and sometimes those aren't always very compatible.
Yeah.
And so I do think that is another, at least they're not compatible in terms of support, so that is something that the 3DS games I do like, is that I can use anyone I want and I can at least get some support so I don't feel like I'm missing out.
I feel like supports in the 3DS games along that line are also a lot more mechanically beneficial than they are in the Game Boy Advance games.
Yeah, they
So
are.
that's probably a big part of that too.
Yeah, I'll have to agree there.
Alright. Okay. Moving on. What are the strengths of Blazing Sword's characterization? Do we need to go over this? I feel like we've kind of already gone over this.
I
Yeah,
think
we
we
kinda
already kind of
Gone over
did
that a
this.
lot already.
Yeah, what I wrote down was the relationship between characters, which is like 50% of what we've been discussing here. So, yeah.
I will say on that point, just briefly, it's been...
I feel like a lot of
Oh, go ahead.
that is expanded. I'm gonna go.
Gotcha. I was just gonna say, I have noticed it is 2018, I played this in, 2004 or 5, so 13, 14 years. I have thought often, years after putting this game down, I have thought often of characters from this game. I have made comparisons to Geitz and Nino and Jafar and Elowood, Hector, and Lynn in, daily life, and I think that's just a testament to how good the characterization is. The mark of a good and memorable character is that, lessons you learned from them are just going to show up in the 10 plus years, geez, I'm old, in the long time since I first picked up this game. Okay, I'm good. I think we can move on to the next question.
So, we already discussed the villain, so I guess we can skip the villain's question. I guess that
Yeah,
means
that was
we'll
like
just
the first thing we did.
I think we'll move on to the gameplay then. In which case, what are the strengths of Blazing Swords gameplay? Marissa, why don't you start out?
I think that it's probably one of the most polished games in the series. It doesn't feel to me it doesn't feel cheap, obviously because it doesn't have ambush reinforcements is a big part of that. But also with the RNG, I like the fact that it has a 2-number RNG. And I'm actually not a big fan of the RNG-based skills like Soul and Luna and Astra and all of that. It bothers me more in the 3DS games than it does in say, like, the Teleus games, just because there's so much more prevalence in the 3DS games. And I feel like it makes the game too RNG-based, where in Fire Emblem 7 doesn't do any of that. I also like how any of the character, if you don't care about efficiency, you can really make any character work just by putting the effort into them. And as one other minor thing, I like the Magic Trinity a lot.
Yeah, the double weapon
Please bring it
triangle.
back. Please bring the Magic Trinity back, Insist. God, I beg you.
I like
Yeah,
the
it's fine.
Magic Trinity as well.
I do too. R.I.P. Light Magic, we knew you well. But yeah, I totally agree. The gameplay of FE7 is very, very polished. And while I don't see a lot of immediate actual strengths to the gameplay, I don't really see that as a bad thing in this game, because I feel like just about everything FE7 actually does as a game, mechanically, works. I can't really think of a thing that it does that doesn't really work, to be quite frank. Like, I don't know, how do you guys feel about that one?
FE7
I have
to
one
me,
thing, but I was going to bring that up later. Go ahead.
FE7 to me,
Actually, no, Luna's broken, sorry.
yeah,
That's the one
Luna's
thing that I
pretty
think
good.
doesn't work, just because it's so freaking broken.
Luna is a very good weapon. Well, the Game Boy Advance trio as a whole, gameplay-wise, borrows very heavily from Thracia, which everybody knows I adore that game. So, to me, the way that Blazing Blade works is, it feels like a more... I don't want to... It feels like a more bright, welcoming idea of how Thracia was supposed to work. Because, like, it has the Constitution, it has the rescue mechanic, it has all these similarities. And unlike Binding Blade, Blazing Blade brings back diverse objectives, and Blazing Blade has the unique weather mechanic, which I thought was pretty cool, honestly, because, like, I mean, people don't like having their movement impeded, but I think it works well as a timing thing and a thematic thing. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, to me, Blazing Blade doesn't really innovate, but it doesn't have to, because it has a great basis to work on, and it works, like you said.
I'd say Blazing Swords gameplay is very vanilla, for lack of a better term. It's like, this is the basic
That's a
bare
good word.
bones type of Fire Emblem gameplay, and I do think it works for what the game's trying to do. Well, I tend to prefer mechanical experimentation, and I give Fire Emblem games props for being able to invent new mechanics, especially if they, become series staples. I do appreciate the fact that Blazing Sword doesn't have massive glaring flaws like some games do. Like, with some Fire Emblem games, people will instantly think, oh, this game has this mechanic that kind of sucks, or it has this part that I just really don't like. You don't really get that for Blazing Sword. It's like, oh, the gameplay is just, it's fine. It's really not amazing, but it's fine. It works,
Yeah,
Maybe-
for me, the biggest
You
thing...
hit that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, the
Sorry.
biggest thing for me like that by far is ambush reinforcements, as I already mentioned, which I absolutely hate. And...
We all do, I think.
Okay. So, like, that's one that as soon as I see that mechanic in any Fire Emblem game, I'm like, damn it, I have to deal with this now. And it's just, I love the fact that I can go back to Fire Emblem 7 and not deal with that.
Yeah, and like Grant hit it totally on the head, because that's almost exactly what I had written down. was that Fire Emblem 7's gameplay is so vanilla in almost everything it does, but it does it so well. It takes the most bare-bone mechanic Fire Emblem mechanics, and it just plays them elegantly. So like it doesn't, because it doesn't feel vanilla, you know what I mean by that.
Exactly. No, I know totally what you're getting at. There's an article I read at some point. I think it was about Final Fantasy, maybe. It made some comparison that literature nerd that I am, I really enjoyed. They were saying that some games aim to be more Shakespeare's, and some games aim more to be Eugene O'Neill's, which is to say, some games want to take a formula and be the best possible work within that formula, where other games don't mind if they're a little bit rough around the edges, as long as they break new ground and do it in a way that just drops your jaw. And I think Blazing Sword, to me, is more of... I tend to prefer the Shakespeares over the O'Neills most often, in terms of games, at least. I think that Blazing Sword is more of a Shakespeare approach in that I really got the sense, as Guy said, going back and playing Thracia after I had played Blazing Sword, I got the sense that I was like, oh wow, this is where all these ideas began. And I just think that the process from the 5th Fire Emblem through the 7th, and really probably through the 8th or 9th Fire Emblem, was kind of an iterative process of taking a bunch of cool features that they knew wanted to belong in Fire Emblem somehow, and just streamlining and streamlining and streamlining until they got to a product that was within a certain very rigid formula, but really, really smooth within that formula. And that's how Blazing Sword feels to me. This is going to feel like a super cop-out answer, but it's got game feel. It's got like that kind of mumbo-jumbo term that makes everything feel like it has a good pace and objective and momentum and structure that just gives you an engrossing sense of being part of something the entire way. That's how it feels to me.
Oh wow, that lit reference. I really liked that. Oh, comments. Compared to Fire Emblem 6, Fire Emblem 7 is buttery as heck. What does buttery mean?
Like slick, smooth, refined.
Oh!
Which I agree.
Salty.
I agree with. I think...
Thanks, Alan.
John, you just pointed out how kind of the 5th through 6, 7, 8, maybe 9, if we can throw 9 in there on some counts, is kind of this growing process. I think 6 is kind of where those growing pains show through the most. And then 7, if you notice, Fire Emblem 6 tried to be like the first one. The only objective was C's. There was one Lord, and he was okay. And Fire Emblem loves its archetypes, but the ones in Binding Blade they tend a little closer to the originals than some of the other ones we see in the series. Whereas we come to FE7 and we see suddenly, defend objectives are back, for example.
Yeah.
Fire Emblem 7 kind of went back to what Thracia was doing. Which, as a Thracia fanboy, makes me extremely happy and is one of the big reasons I like this game, looking at the series as a whole. Is because Blazing Blade it simply does a lot of the things I like, and even though it streamlines them, and to some people that's going to be a negative, that's because it's not, they don't have all of these super in-depth systems to sink their teeth into. What Fire Emblem 7 does have, it does very well. Just my take on comparing the games in this era.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And like I just said in the chat, Fire Emblem 6, in comparison to 7, just felt very directionless and barren as a game.
Well,
and it almost feels like they didn't know quite what they wanted to do with it.
And you're not wrong. I'm a sucker for the history of video game series I like and how they get from influences outside of gaming to where they are. So if I can go on a tangent for a minute, FE6 was originally supposed to be a lot closer to FE5 than it actually is. It looked a lot more the same, it played a lot more the same. And then they decided that they wanted to not do that. They wanted to be different from what Kaga was doing, since he was gone at that point. So they took away some of the more contested, more complicated systems from Thracia. That's why fatigue and dismounting and capturing are gone in the Game Boy games. But they kept, like Rescue, they kept the Constitution system. And, I mean, like I just said, FE6 tried to go back to what FE1 was. They tried very hard to kind of reboot the series. And it kind of didn't work, in my opinion.
Yeah, I kind of don't blame them, though, because the whole mind behind the series was gone. So I really don't blame them for wanting to try and do their own thing. But at the same time, while they were doing that, they tried too hard to beat Kaga.
It's FE6. That's what I mean. Like it's a very weird growing pain series point in the series, because like they tried very hard to both do something different, but also stick very closely to what the groundwork Kaga had left before.
Yeah. oh, exactly. But like the thing like that I just makes me really sad is that it tried so hard to be Kaga, like Kaga's works, without having any of the soul behind Kaga's work.
Whereas, to kind of move away from being negative to FE6, FE7, I think, understood a little bit better by this point, like what the good things that they should keep from the Kaga era, and the things maybe, to refine. Like, I said it twice already, but I think the biggest thing for me was having more than one objective. To like that spices up the gameplay so much, because you're not always just doing the same thing. If we look at the history of the series, the first one, the only thing you did was seize. You go from point A to point B, and it doesn't matter how you get there. That's it. Gaiden, all you have, with two exceptions that it doesn't tell you are exceptions, is defeat all the enemies on the map and you move on. Okay. I don't hate route as much as most people do, but it'd be nice to have something different. FE3 goes back to seize only. FE4 is still seize only, and then we saw FE5, where suddenly you have escape, you have defend, which they added those on top of seize, and then we even had an arrive map, which was, all of those were first for the series. Then what does FE6 do? Goes back to only seize.
Yeah, I agree that the different map objectives are definitely a strength of the series in general, in any of the games that have it.
Mm-hmm.
I was really happy when we were first hearing about Fates, and they said that Conquest was going to have a big stress on different kinds of map objectives, because I really feel like the variety definitely adds to whichever game it's in.
I love it. I agree with that. So like I said, FE6 went back to the one objective. Then FE7 has a lot of defend maps, actually, which I am a fan of, because defend is my favorite objective.
I was going to say, I think defend is my favorite too.
Love that one.
Actually, escape is my favorite.
Well, escape maps are pretty good too, but I think... well, my favorite map in the series is a defend map, so... They're both really good objectives.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, I could go on and on, but I think I've made my point.
Oh, sorry. I should have. I'm sorry. Does anyone else have anything else to add? Okay. Next point. Let's see. Gameplay point B. Since Blazing Sword was the first internationally released Fire Emblem game, how well do you think it works as an introduction for newcomers to the series?
It's a very mixed bag, in my opinion, on this point. because on the one hand, this game has a very extensive tutorial, which, it was the first one targeted at younger audiences, and it was also the first one to release outside of Japan. And at this point in video game history, Japanese developers didn't really think that Europeans and Americans, especially Americans, would like this kind of game. They didn't think we wanted strategy games. But they gave it a shot because of how popular Marth and Roy had been in Smash Bros. So they took great care to make sure that, us dumb Americans would understand what we were doing. But on the flip side, I've heard a lot of stories from friends, like people who tried to get their friends into the series, and because everybody says this is the best starting point, they tried to get them started here, and they didn't like it because they felt like the game was treating them like an idiot. It wouldn't let them actually play the game because it was too busy telling them how to play the game.
Yeah.
Which I think...
Instead of letting them play it, yeah.
Which, if we look even just 2 games prior, I promise I'll stop, wanking to Thracia eventually, but just 2 games prior, look at that first map. We had like a full village with several houses. You could approach it in many different ways. You had a lot of different playable units. I think 8 join you in Chapter 1 in that game. And how does Blazing Sword start? 1 player unit, 2 enemy units. That's not, it starts off very slow and kind of meandering about, just, in my opinion at least, that's my biggest problem with this game, is how it doesn't respect the player's intelligence.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree, because when I got my ass kicked at Sacred Stones and decided to go to FE7 at my cousin's recommendation, I was going through the tutorial, and the tutorial itself does a good job of explaining what to do, but it doesn't do a very good job at letting you do it.
It's interesting. I personally think I have a lot more tutorial tolerance than your average player of video games, so maybe my data point isn't necessarily the best one to use here, but to me, looking back on those first 10 chapters of Blazing Sword, seem outrageously hand-holdy, like everybody is saying. But in the moment, when I was actually playing this game for the first time, had never picked up a Fire Emblem before, back in, a decade plus ago, I didn't feel like it was at all a problem. I felt like it was actually quite a well-paced introduction to something I wasn't very familiar with at the time. So yeah, it's kind of an odd trade-off, right? Because I think, at least on my own experience, I thought it worked as a really effective introduction for a newcomer to the series. I think looking back on it, Lin normal mode to someone who is familiar with Fire Emblem already is quite a different beast than it would be to a newcomer, though. So it's really a question of who the audience is, as usual, and how one makes a video game for all possible audiences.
I would say the same, where, just like you, Fire Emblem 7 was my first Fire Emblem. So at the time that I was playing it, I didn't feel like it was holding my hand too much. I felt like it was teaching me how to play. And I felt like it was setting me up for a much bigger game in which everything it was teaching me was going to become more relevant. So at the time, it didn't bother me. I am absolutely sure that if I went back and played Lin's normal now, it would probably drive me crazy. So I'm grateful at least that Lin's hard mode exists. But as someone who started the series with Fire Emblem 7, I felt like the tutorial was a strength.
And part of that was the writing too, right? Because the characters are the ones conducting it. Lin's telling you, like, okay, we're going to make this together. We're going to do this together. Sane's out there in the field, like, let me demonstrate to my lady. Show me to the nearest enemy. And you have Wallace, like, use the seal on me. I can do it. Use the seal. And it's just like, you have all these characters like characterizing themselves through the act of conducting the tutorial. Like I didn't feel it was wasted
yes,
time.
there's also when Sane forgets to bring a Vulnerary, and Kent gets mad at him
Right.
about that. That's a good point, because a lot of tutorials, it's just like a voice of God kind of speaking to you and telling you what to do, but in this one it's actually the characters being like, hey, let's do this, and it's a neat way to characterize them.
I actually do think Blazing Sword's a really good introduction to the series. I think some of you may have read this, but I did a blog post where I took a look at the difficulty scaling of all the different Fire Emblem. At the end, one of the criteria I used was which one is good to introduce newcomers to. I actually do think Fire Emblem 7, 9, and the 3DS games are really good to introduce people to. Because Lin mode, let's be honest, Lin mode was quite clearly designed for newcomers, because the designers knew, hey, this is the first game that's going to be released outside of Japan. Other people don't have the point of reference of Fire Emblem like the Japanese mode. And even though I agree with Guy that, if you go back to Lin mode, especially the non-hard mode, it literally holds your hand. I remember trying to replay it on a ROM, and I just got so frustrated with it, because it's like, I wanted to move my character a different direction. It's like, no, you must move here. Or I wanted to take the Night Crest away from Wallace and give it to Sane or Kane. No, you have to promote me. And it's like, oh.
Or if you accidentally move to the wrong space, it'll repeat the entire tutorial segment and make you do it again.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the one hand,
I hate that.
So I see where Guy's coming from, but at the same time, I do think it serves its purpose for newcomers and for new players. I think Guy brought up a point that I agree with, is that a lot of the new games tend to treat the player like an idiot. Even Don made this point when he was doing his Thracia 0% growths run. And on the one hand, that sucks, and I do wish newer games would have a little more faith. But on the other hand, sometimes you kind of do need to lead people by the hand. Sometimes it's just a necessity just to get people introduced. And hey, 2 members of our podcast were introduced via Blazing Swords, and they love the Fire Emblem series, so it clearly did its job.
Well, see, maybe I didn't make this clear enough. My point wasn't as a general rule of thumb it doesn't work, because clearly it does for some people, but I also said I've heard stories where people tried to get their friends into it with Blazing Sword, and they didn't like it because they felt like they were being treated like idiots. I think it just comes down to a personal preference thing. Like, do you like being walked through step by step to start things off, so that like later on you have a better, more thorough understanding without having to try again? Or do you prefer throwing yourself at this obstacle until you triumph? It's just a personal preference thing. I don't think one is necessarily better than the other, but I prefer the games that let me, figure things out for myself most of the time.
Yeah, my personal preference is that I believe some hand-holding is good, but I don't like too much hand-holding.
I think that makes sense, and it's always going to be really difficult for any game developer to sit down and say, oh, well, this is clearly the method of teaching people to play this game that's going to work in every case, because there's not such a case. I think games in general have gone through kind of fads and vogues about what the best way, the generally recognized way, I guess, is in which they conduct a tutorial and teach a player how to play the game, right? Back in the dawn of the video game, there was just nothing. Maybe you read the manual and picked up a couple hints, but you were just kind of plunged into the action. And then after a while, people figured out that, a lot of people would be at sea, and maybe it's best that we tell them all the complicated and cool things we're doing at this game. And so you have games like Fire Emblem Blazing Sword that came out of an era where the generally accepted practice was to deliver, enormous tutorials that held your hand through absolutely every action, just so you knew what you were doing and why you were doing it. And now that criticism of games has become an industry, and people have analyzed, like the first level of Super Mario Brothers to death, and there's, plenty of analysis saying, like, here is how you teach a game to make players learn by doing it. We've kind of, the pendulum has swung back around, right? And we have another age of games that are starting to not have tutorials and just try to accomplish teaching by design, sometimes with great success, sometimes very little. So I think it's entirely, a creature of fad and of the times, how games approach a tutorial style, and there's always going to be someone a certain style doesn't click for. So
yeah,
exactly.
I think
it's like the. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I think a really good way to address that would just be to make Lynn's normal tail or Lynn's hard mode both be available from the start, and let the player pick which one they want to do.
I can totally agree with that, because anytime you have to boot up a new file of FE7 for, say, example, you buy it on the Wii U eShop, you have to redo that tutorial, even if you played it a million times. But anyways, a tutorial in a video game is like the education system. You can teach one way, but it's not going to work for everyone. Every single person is different, and everyone learns in a different way.
Exactly.
Very much so.
So not every tutorial is going to work for everyone, and as we were saying earlier, I absolutely agree that any tutorial, doesn't matter what game it is or what the tutorial is doing, it depends on the person that's playing the game, on whether or not it'll work.
And with that, we can move into the next point. That is, if Fire Emblem 7 is ever going to get the
actually,
echoes.
whoops,
Sorry,
Grant. Before we move on, I've got my own question that sort of bridges off the last one, if you don't mind, unless you'd like to do yours next.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So my question is related a little bit to map design. Looking at those tutorial levels kind of reminded me of what I was thinking, which is I am a big fan of well-designed small maps that always come at the beginning of the game, right? We kind of see Fire Emblem 6 to an extent, and 7 to a greater extent, spending a lot of time at the beginning of the game with short, tiny maps that are done pretty quickly. And that's kind of a new thing, because, like I was saying, Thracia just drops you in an entire village and gives you 8 units and tells you, have fun.
Or how about Holy War, where you're dropped into like
bigger?
Yeah.
So it's like it's I guess it's a different approach to map making. I enjoy kind of the crescendo effect that you get from starting off with these little maps with a handful of people and building up from there, but only insofar as those maps are well done. And I think these maps are well done, but I wanted to get y'all's sense of that. Like, what do you think about this kind of small map into larger map approach that Blazing Sword takes?
I'm with you on that. I like it. I think it's a good build. So I'm pretty much just going to say what you just said. I don't really have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree on the whole with that one. Don't really have much to add for that subject.
Yeah, neither do I.
But then again, I'm just not the biggest on map design, and Mr. Alan Kofelt in the chat can attest to that, since we design our own and I kind of suck at helping.
And this relates right back into the personal preference issue too, right? Because, if you're going to have a super hand-holdy tutorial, you can get away with tiny maps that are done in 5 minutes but teach you everything you need to know. Where if you're going to have a tutorial where you need to, where you're asked to pretty much learn by experience, that kind of necessitates the sort of larger experimental approach that Thracia pretty much throws at you and says, here is a situation, figure out how to deal with it, and then by design kind of lets you intuit a good way to figure it out. Again, I think it's a matter of personal preference. I like them both, but I also like really good small maps.
Oh, well, now that you mention it, I do have something to say. Something that kind of stuck out to me when I was playing through Fire Emblem 12 again is small maps are really not always the way to go. Sometimes, there are plenty of maps that would be, what in my opinion would have been better if they were actually bigger. I know that FE4 is kind of given a stigma to big maps, but opposite extreme is really any better. Like, small maps that can be dealt with and obliterated easily, in my opinion, really designed maps. A good map should not be super easy to trivialize just from its structure. Like, it's one thing if a player gets good and manages to use the tools at their disposal well, but it's another if a map's like, here's one enemy, go kill them. You know, it's a problem I have with Echoes and Gaiden. I'm actually playing through Echoes again with a non-class optimized run. Anyway, so I kind of feel like it needs to be a healthy balance between the two. Some maps do need to be big, and some maps can be smaller, not small per se. Because I kind of do agree with Guy that there does need to be at least a little bit of intuition, a bit of trial and error. Also, Alan pointed out in the chat, and I agree with them, that many of the Fates prologue chapters are just way too freaking small. And smaller maps mean that there's less room for movement. Less room for movement means that unit positioning kind of gets thrown out the window.
Oh, yes. Like the Fates early maps, where
Well, like how the
it's
Fates
just
prologue
entirely trial and error
doesn't even
about
let
where
you
you stand.
move.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of maps and Fates are just trial and error, and a lot of basic tactics just don't work a lot in a lot of Fates maps in general, but that's just me.
Like the first prologue chapter, you literally don't even have to attack to win. It just automatically will just say map complete. Like,
Wait,
turn-
really?
Yep.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? I've
Nope.
been doing the whole map this whole time. Oh my god. I'm so mad now.
Huh. I
Okay,
didn't
that's
know
it. I'm
that either.
uninstalling Fates when I'm off of this.
Talk about insulting the player's intelligence, am I right?
Yeah.
Doesn't get any worse than that.
To be fair, this is
Oh.
only about 3 button presses away from the defeat of Bata the Beast, so there you go.
Yeah, can't argue with that.
I mean, but at least you still have to do something in that chapter.
Truth. Fun fact, and when I played it on hard mode the first time, he killed me. At the usual part of the map where she beats the first brigand and is damaged, and she usually turns to the camera and she says, "I have need of a vulnerary." I was like, "No, you don't." And I marched her forward to her doom. That was the end of the Lorca tribe.
I actually did the same thing, and it was like, no, Lynn, you can be a man. Take that boy on. And then she died.
Nope.
Yep.
I haven't
That
done
happened
that
to me as
in.
well.
I haven't done that
It's
in
happened to me at least
7,
once.
but I have done that in FE8. I've had Erica die on me.
Dope.
I've actually had Lynn die in the first chapter of Blazing Sword, like during her Lynn mode. Because I thought, the RNG will save me. Nope. Screw you, Anna.
What's a backup plan?
That's a backup plan, precious. Anyway.
Vulneraries? We don't need those. What are we, a bunch of pussies? We're men, we can take this.
We might need the Vulnerine later, so we shouldn't use it now.
That was
Yeah,
my
exactly.
thinking.
What if there's a bigger emergency than Boothe the Beast? But if we
Exactly.
use the vulnerary, then we won't be able to deal with the bigger emergency later.
That was precisely my thinking. I was just like, oh, well, I can save a charge of the vulnerary. Beat him. Turns out, I was wrong.
That is me in RPGs so hard. I stockpile stuff. What if there's an emergency? I get into an emergency. Okay, but what if there's a bigger emergency?
Yep.
Definitely.
It's like that meme. Oh, I need to save my Brave Lance for the chapter. It's the end of the chapter. Oh, I still need to save this. There might be another emergency that comes up.
It's
Oh
the
no,
next
I'm
chapter.
dying. I mean, I'm not going to use this elixir. What if I'm dying harder next chapter?
It's the final boss. But you never know.
What if there are more
I'm
children?
out of MP, then use an ether, but I only have 86 of them.
What if I accidentally completed these side objectives that I didn't know about, and there's another chapter after this one? I don't know.
Yep.
And this is why we are expert tacticians. Okay, I think we've said enough about small maps for my benefit. So I appreciate you following me down this detour.
Oh, I appreciate it. I'm glad you brought it up. All right, so I think this is the last question of the Well, I guess if Fire Emblem 7 were to ever get the Echoes treatment like Gaiden did, what would you hope to see? What changes would you like them to accomplish?
I'd like to see memory prisms added
Gonna
in.
be the first to. Yeah, I would like memory prisms, but actual gameplay and story-wise, I don't really see the need for many changes. Like, I would like a graphical upgrade and stuff, but I don't really see a lot that needs fixing or adjusting.
Yeah, other than
I have a little bit of a list.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh,
I love
Alright.
I have Fire Emblem 7. I love it. Absolutely love it. But there are a handful of things that I would definitely change. And when we were talking about strengths of it, I think I mentioned that there's one big thing that I would alter. And I really hate the class promotion items a lot.
Oh, wait, yeah, you know what? Yeah.
Part of it is
I forgot about that.
I absolutely admit that part of it is Matthew. And, of course, his promotion item doesn't come in until, like, almost the end of the game. So he just sits at level 20 for me for the whole game. So I actually don't. I'd be fine with removing them altogether, but they are a little bit of a plot point with the Heaven Seals. So I had another idea, which was to actually make them function more like occult scrolls.
Oh, okay.
You'd still get the flavor of them, which I do like, without being limited to how many characters of a certain class type you can promote, or waiting to get the fell contract the whole game. It would help the lords a lot because they all promote so late. And just make promotion be like general master seals or just automatically promote at level 20.
I wrote this down in the chat, but I'd say accessible supports.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I kind of lied. I want that and fix promotion items.
Agreed.
Oops. But that's it. That's the only thing that needs actual changing. Everything else is beautiful.
I'm crazy.
I
I
also-
actually would like to have a lunatic.
That
Yeah,
was
I would
exactly
like
what
to-
I was about to say. Was added
Yeah.
harder difficulty
No,
setting.
get that shit out of here.
Yeah, I want it because I
So-
love it, but it's a pretty easy game. So I would love for a harder mode.
But Hector hard mode though.
That's cute.
You're bolder folks than me.
I'm joking. Anytime I say FE7's easy, I've had a couple people jump and yell at me, being like, "You all play Hector hard mode, figged."
Hector harder mode.
Sure.
Yes, Hector hard mode Lunatic Plus edition. Thank you, Christian. Hector
Another
hard
thing.
mode Lunatic Plus reverse.
This is
No.
a minor thing. I feel it kind of goes without saying, but I would still really want this because I love this. Is the critical cutting quotes?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
those
Those
are
added.
also great.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that it's something I'd actually rather them kind of keep the way it is, but I feel like if they would never keep this, but I'd like them to, is that I actually like the 2D battle sprites way more than the 3D battle sprites. I think they have a lot more character. So, while I feel like they would definitely go to the 3D ones, I would rather them stick with the 2D.
I worry what cutaway quotes would do to the quality of the writing if they changed that, but it's just me.
Actually, something I actually kind of forgot to mention, something I would want is for them to add more differences to Elliewood's mode to make it, to give more reasons for you to come back to it after you've finished it and unlocked Hector's mode. Because once you unlock Hector's mode, I don't really feel like there's much reason to go back to Elliewood's story, because in a lot of ways, Hector's story ends up being superior.
Well,
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
Because I believe you get more loot, you get 2 extra characters, I think at least 2, with Farina and Carla. There's more story content, and there's better difficulty. And you don't get any of that with Elliewood mode.
Yeah, I don't think there aren't any characters that are exclusive to Elliewood's Tale, are there?
no.
No.
Likewise, the only chapters that are
Everyone you get in Elliewood's mode, you get in Hector's mode, and in Hector's mode, you get 2 characters that you don't get in Elliewood's.
yeah. I think it'd be cool if there were more chapters, kind of like the Durandal versus Armad's chapters. How those are, you're not gaining a chapter, it's just a different one. If there were more like that were just different.
So I know you said you didn't like the RNG reliance skills, Marissa, but I actually wouldn't mind if we got some kind of skills in.
Darn it, Grant!
FP7
I was gonna ask this question.
I don't know. I feel like it spices up the combat.
I was gonna say.
I love skills. I just don't like the RNG elements of them. So, I mean, I'd actually love for skills to be implemented in the same way that they are in Heroes, where it works with a countdown instead of being RNG based.
Actually, I agree with you on that point. As much as I like
That's
skills, I
really
do think they are RNG reliant, and it's kind of why you don't see as many enemies have those types of skills, and that when Conquest tried to do it, it turned out to be a negative.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So I would like for them to add skills if they did it like that instead of like in Fates and Conquest or Fates and Awakening.
Actually, I think it could potentially be interesting if they add combat arts like they did in Echoes.
I was gonna say that
could
have them be
potentially
command
be
based, not cooldown, not RNG, but have them, command, and I guess
That would be fine too.
maybe not take away from health, but maybe they could go the more traditional RPG route and have like some MP system or some other resource like that when you use a command based skill, it takes away from that. Maybe, I don't know.
Spend HP to use a command-based skill.
Well, see, I was gonna say that, but at the same time, I feel like the HP costing thing is kind of a Valentia thing, and I feel like that should stay in Valencia. I love it. I'm just
as
saying,
long as there's some kind of a cost to it, so that you can't always do it. So there's some kind of a drawback.
Something where you don't get a follow-up attack, or maybe your defense is lowered while you're attacking, or something like that. Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
That could be really interesting, actually. I would be interested to see how they could pull off and balance something like that in a full-scale Fire Emblem game.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What about you, Guy? I felt like you were trying to say something.
I mean, other than like some of the obvious things, like add in casual mode, add in a higher difficulty, make it look prettier, make it sound prettier. Other than the obvious things, I don't really have anything else to add. The thing I was gonna say was the skills thing. I was gonna say like, not so much this is how they should add it. I was more gonna open up a discussion, but we already had it. So
It'd be kind of interesting to see what kind of, if they decided to do like the Shadows of Valencia type voice acting.
Oh yeah, I would love full voice acting with FE7, not even gonna lie. I really hope that they continue doing that and make that a future trend with the games.
And Shadows of Valencia had a really good voice acting too. Like, holy cow!
Oh my god.
Absolutely.
There was like characters like Berkut. Sorry, I'm gonna not talk about this for too long because I don't want to derail too hard. But characters like Berkut would not have as much of an emotional impact as they did if it weren't for the fantastic voice work that was done.
Definitely.
And I do think that full voice acting is something that absolutely should return in the next Fire Emblem game because it had such a great effect.
Point. Like, I feel like that it's here to stay. Which is fine by me. I
certainly
like
hope
it.
so.
Yeah. Especially since now they're moving to a much more powerful
Like,
system.
I don't like the partial voice acting like in Awakening and Fates, because then we had awkward situations where, like, Sumiya would just randomly be making a pie and she'd look at Crom and be like, "Oh, my love," and just totally out of the blue or just saying random shit that made no sense in context. And it was really awkward. So...
I didn't think it was awkward at first, but after hearing the full voice acting in Echoes, I go back and it does feel stiff.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. It's like it didn't
And I
bug
like
me
too
until
how
I
they're
saw better.
I think another understated benefit of full voice acting like that is that it actively clarifies how certain names are pronounced. Because I know Marm was basically he was correcting a pronunciation of Legault, and it was like, this is why Echo's voice acting is so great. Because I remember Radiant Dawn came out, heard how they pronounced Sephiroth's name. I was like, yes, this is how I've been pronouncing his name all along. Vindication!
Oh man, when we did the Sacred Stones podcast, a lot of that was just us discussing how we pronounce the names.
Yeah. I think we went back and forth for like every character in this game at one point, figuring out how we each pronounce it. That was actually kind of funny.
It was funny, but it took up a little more time than it should have.
Yeah, I agree. There was I felt there was a lot of time wasted there, but you know, I digress.
I have a question regarding if Fire Emblem 7 ever got the remake treatment.
Yeah.
This is an area where I'm a little conflicted myself. How would you guys feel about the avatar system of it?
No.
No.
Okay.
Really?
Would you? What I'm really wondering is, would you say that it should stay the way that it is currently, where you are a character but you don't actually participate in the gameplay at all, or try to remove that altogether? Like, I'm not sure exactly how I'd want to see that done.
I would
Actually, you know what I want? I would actually be. I think I might be a little okay with having an avatar in an FE7 remake. However, no story roles, because every single playable avatar we've has had a story role, and it's messed with the narrative so hard. With Chris, we had them taking all of the glory away from Marth. With Robin, we had Robin stealing the spotlight and not letting Kron be the protagonist of his own game. With Corrin, we had just Corrin going around doing Corrin things. I don't even. Oh, okay. But like, if FE7 remake had an avatar, I would be okay. I think I would be okay with having it, but no story role, and just making them be like a silent, mostly silent character.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say I would like to see either an all or nothing thing. I'd personally like to see them be made a playable unit, where, like in New Mystery of the Emblem, you can choose their starting class, but keep their like role otherwise as it is, where the characters talk to you, but you don't talk to them. Or on the flip side, I would rather this over it stay as is. Just take out the tactician entirely, and just have the characters, as they are. Because as it is, honestly, I don't really see much point to it.
Go on. Sorry.
No, that's all. It's just I don't see any point to it as it is. Because like when after your first playthrough, you can flat out choose not to make a tactician. So like all that does is takes away a couple of the lines where the characters talk directly to you, the player, and takes away some like mild bonuses that some characters of the certain affinity that you have get, and that's it. It's like either all or nothing for me.
I would honestly just prefer to keep it as is because, Alessia already went into all the reasons why the Avatar screwed over the narrative, but they also tend to screw over the gameplay balance as well. FE12 has some of the worst unit balance in the series. Awakening's got flaws. Revelations sucks, and Conquest is a lot worse than people seem to think. Birthright tends to be the exception, but whenever there's a playable avatar, they're always ridiculously OP, and I would rather not have that. So let's just keep.
Yeah,
I would rather just keep it as is.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that the avatars in Fire Emblem don't even technically fit the actual meaning of avatar, of a playable avatar. They're not playable. They're not avatars. They're a customizable, predefined character. There's a huge world of difference. An avatar is a character that you customize for something like World of Warcraft.
Mm-hmm.
A customizable character is something like Robin, who has a predefined personality, predefined backstory, all that crap. You're just changing the way their hairstyle is.
It's definitely nothing like, say, Mass Effect, where you actually make like decisions all throughout the game that influence your character.
No, exactly, and that's why I don't want it to come back, because they say it's an avatar, but it's not.
What do you think, John?
I'm also suspicious of avatars. I should really work at intelligent systems because I must be allergic to change. Whenever this sort of question comes up, and we have the specter of the Echo's treatment reviving and remaking a game that's happened in the past, there are a lot of good ideas, but in the end, it always just leaves me cold. Like what we've talked about so far, right? We've talked about potentially changing the tactician element. We've talked about potentially changing the access to support conversations. We've talked about changing other elements of gameplay. And like, as much as I agree with the idea that they should be changed, like, every time I think of that, I'm just like, oh, but what if that changes some other element of the gameplay that we weren't even thinking about? Like, what if increased access to support conversations somehow changes the quality of the writing? What if, like, cutaway quotes for critical hits suddenly cheapen the characterization because it reduces them to a bunch of tropes? Like, there are a lot of just reactions I have to the question of a remake that in the end always convince me that I would prefer not to see a remake than to see a remake that tries to make changes to this game. Especially for this game, when I love the original product so much, I think it's better that we leave the original story put the way it is, even with flaws, and move on from it, because I just don't see any change to its formula that's going to make it better, in my view, without risks.
Well, that is a good point, because, yeah, the idea of unforeseen consequences is definitely something heard of video game. That being said, though, there's also the possibility for change being a good thing, because as someone who played Gaiden and then played Echo, and then Shadows of Valencia, I do think Shadows of Valencia is the superior game to the predecessor. Granted, it had advantages that a FE7 remake wouldn't have, but I bring it up because I do think it is possible that a remake can be better than the original. Oh yeah, for sure. I totally agree, and particularly with, well, full disclosure, I haven't played Echoes, but I am midway through a playthrough of Gaiden right now, and just like my impression of most of the other NES-era Fire Emblem games, like, anything that commits more to storytelling than those early games do would be doing it better, in my view. But, like, you know, that said, those games, like, the earlier stuff was from a time when the focus of the developers wasn't so much on telling a story as getting the mechanics of a game right, and telling the story they could on the limited amount of space that they had to tell it. And I think, as you know, the hardware has grown, and as the motivations of the development team have grown from, you know, just making a game to a changing definition of what a game is that includes a story now, I think later games like Blazing Sword stand on a much different ground. And, you know, where in a game like this, where previous effort has been spent to essentially, you know, tell a good story as well as make an engaging game, and, you know, making those two parts of a whole product, I think one risks a lot more in any remake if one tries to change that formula around. That's just my take. That's just the take of a stodgy old man who played this over a decade ago and fell in love with it then.
To be fair, though, it is a valid point. So, I mean, I'm glad you said something.
Yeah, there always is a chance that the remake will do a great disservice to the original.
Yeah, I mean...
At the same time, though,
Oh, sorry.
At the same time, though, I never feel like that necessarily takes away from the original. So I think there's that as well. Anyway, you were gonna say?
Sorry. What I was gonna say is I totally understand where you're coming from, because I have a massive boner for FE4. Like all the cat levels of massive boner we're talking about, and I want more than anything for an Echo-style remake of Holy War, but I am so scared they're gonna botch it. So I'm so scared they're gonna make those kinds of changes that are gonna downgrade the story from what I know and love. So I'm totally on board with you, John.
You could say you're afraid it's going to go up in flames, like Sigurd.
But
So funny. Get the fuck out. It's okay. You're still cool.
It's true. That's debatable.
You're still cool. Don't come to NMCJ tomorrow.
you can still take love reacts from me, John.
Thanks, Grant. Mutual.
Aww. Alright, so does anyone else have anything to add to this? Going once, going twice. Okay, sold. So, guess it's time to wrap this up then. Alright, conclusion. Blazing Sword was released in the USA in November 2003. What is it that draws you personally back to it about 15 years later?
I don't deny that there is definitely a nostalgia level to it. I definitely get very strong nostalgia feelings for Fire Emblem 7, since it was my first Fire Emblem game. I played it about 12 years ago, so there's that. But really, I think it's the characters that bring me back to it every time. I'm still in the process of filling out my full support log. I have most of them, but there are still some I have to get. So I like to come back and work on that. I also like how I have opportunities to train characters that I either haven't trained in a long time or have never trained before, and I'll think about, okay, who's gonna be on my team this time. So I like that element of it too.
I think personally, the reason I come back to Fire Emblem 7 so frequently nowadays is because the characters, I love the characters in this story. They are so three-dimensional and human, and I don't really feel like there's any playable character in Fire Emblem 7 that I dislike. I love all of them. And the way that they interact in the story, and the way the story is told, and the way you see the world from the eyes of your three lords, it captivates me. I've seen the story a billion times. I know it like the back of my hand, for the most part. Every time I replay it, my Kokoro goes doki doki.
I think for me is that FE7 still holds up to scrutiny. Like, I do think it is a pretty solid and legit game. And considering the flaws of some of the more recent entries, it just makes FE7 shine that much more for doing so many different things well. And I don't think there are massive, huge flaws with the game, which from a guy who's got a reputation for being the credit guy, that's a huge plus for the game. Well, yeah, there are games I like more, but I can't bring myself to hate or even dislike it. So, I mean, that's a great testament to it. I think it still does well in the gameplay, and the story and characterization aspects are among some of the best the series has to offer. So yeah, I think it accomplished what it set out to achieve.
What keeps me coming back? Well, I absolutely agree with what everyone's said so far. I mean, just the story and product itself are so glowingly good. Not doubted for a minute that you're part of something special. What keeps me coming back to it years after its release is the fact that I keep coming back to it without sitting down to play it. I'm reminded of it all the time. Like any good I find the measure of a good work of literature or story of some other kind, is just if you've put the book down or you've put the game down and are weeks out from it, and suddenly something happens in your life and you're like, oh man, that reminds me of that one character that did something back in that work that I read, or that reminds me of when Elwood stood up to Queen Helene of Bern, or such and such and such and such. I think those moments are when you finally realize that you've taken a lesson from something, some story that you've read or participated in some way, and you've really taken that lesson to heart in such a way that you can be reminded of it months or years later, and you can think, I must really have been there at the moment when something really happened regarding that work of art. And I think the reason that Blazing Sword keeps me coming back is because it does exactly that to me. In the over 10 years it's been since I first picked up this game, I always come back to it. Like, every now and then something will remind me of a character out of this game. Something will remind me of an event that happened. Or other Fire Emblems will remind me of maps I liked. Or I'll compare things to, how it felt in the Battle Before Dawn. Like, everyone's already said is the reason why, right? It hits that sweet spot because there's a laser focus on being like a whole narrative, a punchy theme, and complete characters, and a really driven, well-paced game, those great supports. It's as close as Fire Emblem ever got to the perfect balance and formula for me. All that. That's why it's a good product. The reason I keep ranking it as one of my favorite games there is just because it life reminds me of it so often. That's why. I don't doubt memories of freshman year painted a little bit extra rosy because of that too, but my memory keeps returning to Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. That's why I play it.
Guy, how about you?
I keep coming back to this game because I appreciate the narrative it has. I appreciate the theme. I like the story. I like the music. It's fun to just sit down and play. We talked at a pretty decent length about how this one feels kind of vanilla. It all works. It's just, it's not too complicated. It's not that hard to get into. So a lot of the times when I want to get my Fire Emblem fix and I don't really have the time to sit down and play through a whole one of them for the 20th time, it's either this one or Sacred Stones that I'll just pick up and I'll just play the first few maps of, just to kill some time, to relax. And like John said, it's not even so much playing it as it is, talking about it or looking at other people talk about it, hearing other people talk about it, why these characters are great, why this story is great, what this did for the series as a whole.
All right. Well, those of you who saw the podcast, thank you so much for coming and adding comments, listening. We really appreciate it. We really do. And to everyone else who was a part of the podcast, thanks for saying yes, for wanting to do this. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I'm very, very excited that you brought up that you needed more people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I
Ever need
absolutely
anyone else
agree.
for another podcast, I'm here, so.
Thanks very much for having me. This was really great.
I still have to do,
Right.
Grant already has some lined up, and I still have to line up Shadow Dragon and Fates.
Fates.
So if anyone wants to, shoot me a message and say, hey, I'm down to hang out with you and crap on Fates for 5 hours, then,
I'll crap on Fates for 5 hours.
Oh, I could do
No,
that.
seriously.
I could crap on
Joke.
Fates, if that's what.
In all seriousness, though, while I still have you guys, I think there are things worth talking about in that game, and if anybody is seriously interested in talking about what could have been and what good is there and why things that could have been good aren't good, like a serious discussion on it, I'm totally down to actually do it.
And I will, and if you'll have me, I will put forth my best effort to do that.
And because
I
still
have
to do
actually
Shadow
been dying
Dragon.
to talk about Fate seriously, so.
Yeah, there have been a lot of times playing Fates where I've had that thought where I'm like, there's something here that if it was executed better, it actually could work really well. But, yeah.
And before we, say our goodbyes and sign off, Josh Staggs, a member of Maine, does streams a lot, and he is actually planning on streaming, continuing his playthrough of Thracia 776 right after this podcast, and he asked me if I could give him a plug. So, his channel, he's in the chat, his Twitch is ATCYJAC. I don't know what that stands for, but go hang out with him and watch him play some Thracia if you want to after this is done. That's all I have left.
Sounds like a good plan.
Mm-hmm.
Well then, I guess, that wraps up everything.
Yep. So, Grant, thanks for having me on, as always. I love doing these.
Yeah, me too. That's why I keep doing them.
And thank you for having me as well. I know I already thanked you, but I had a lot of fun talking about this. So,
Yay.
Same, thank you a lot for including me. I really enjoyed it.
And thanks for including me. I really liked talking about my favorite Fire Emblem, one of my favorite games.
Same.
You're welcome, guys. This was awesome. By the way, Guy, when's the soonest that you can have this up on YouTube so I can put it on my blog?
I was planning on starting on uploading it as soon as we sign off.
All right. Well, cool.
So it'll probably take a while to upload, but because it's like 3.5 hours.
All right, well, in that case, everyone, later.
Peace.
later. Bye.
Bye-bye.